les liens qu'on vous propose en haut. Et vous pouvez aussi, en fait, si vous ne voulez pas accéder à la traduction de l'anglais vers le français, en fait, vous pouvez aussi juste avoir des sous-titres en anglais. Donc, les logiciels vous permettent de faire ce genre de manipulation. So, I think we're good. And back to you.
Thank you. So, hello. So, thank you and good morning again. So, my name is Alice Ningwai Jim, and I am a professor of contemporary art history here at Concordia University. And on behalf of myself and my dear friends, Concordia colleagues, Mei Chiu, Maya Oppenheimer, I'm from UDM, Annalise Alvarez Hernandez, and our colleague from UCAM, Edith. We are pleased to welcome all of you to day 2 of Worlding Public Culture's 2023 Worlding Tiohtià Montreal, Bridging Knowledges, Practices, and Beings. So yesterday we had a beautiful opening with Words Before All Else by Elder Amelia Tequaponti McGregor to start a gathering with good hearts and good minds in a good way. The words are also referred to by the Thanksgiving address, which is a kind of order of greetings to the natural world. So for the Mohawk version, the greeting would include the people, Mother Earth, the waters, the fish, plants, medicine, herbs, animals, birds, the 4 winds, which are strong with us today, the sun, the moon, the stars, our teachers, ancestors, and the creator. And it could go longer as we need. So according to the address, we all have been given the duty to live in balance and harmony with each other and all living things. And so the greeting is structured so that after we thank each of all these living things, one at a time, we respond with the words, now all our minds are one. And there's many things to thank. So it's about 17 times, and that's what you heard yesterday. So Elder Amelia also mentioned that she would offer some closing words. And since she offered them because she is not able to be with us today, and usually it takes place at the end of a gathering, which for our meeting here in Montreal is actually Sunday morning when we all meet to unwind and debrief over a brunch. But it's a way to be able to send you off, for those of you who travel near or far, to get here in a good way on your journey home. So since some of you are going to be journeying to your next destination this evening or tomorrow, this might be a good time just to let you know what the closing words that would be said to all of us. All right. So it goes something like this. We are now arrived at the place where where we end our words. Of all the things we have named, it is not our intention to leave anything out. If something was forgotten, we leave it to each individual to send such greetings and thanks in their own way. So that's that now our minds are one. So likewise today, we would like to acknowledge that Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather today. Tiohtià Montreal is historically known as a gathering place for many nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. And as part of our process of decolonization, we'd like to take this opportunity to ask you to take a moment, especially those of you who are online, to pay respects to the ancestral custodians of wherever you may be presently, or where you are visiting from. And so folks online can actually check out Native land.ca to learn more about different First Nations peoples. So our territorial acknowledgement is actually crafted and shaped and worded with the help and guidance of elders from the community who are based here in Ganyawaga. And so for more information on that, you can also connect online with Indigenous directions at Concordia. So with WPC today, this weekend, I'm going to change my hats. This weekend, we're bringing together scholars, artists, curators, and activists together for 2 days of conversational research, exploring the possibilities of what the art ecology of Montreal, with all its different understanding of what worlding could be. So to think through these questions, yesterday's sessions and the curatorial visits the day before paid attention to pedagogies, different kinds of pedagogies. We considered the changing discipline of art history and pluralizing global art histories, and looking at, for example, the unit of analysis of the academy or academies in the case of WPC's project. We also considered the work of emerging scholars who attend to these ideas and who inevitably will be in the future the generation that brings forward emerging fields in our areas that are need to constantly be changing and be refueled and reviewed at all times. We also, I love this part, was considered the place of digital participation, and for me it links so closely to digital storytelling, which also of course is a form of world making, and to bring that into the conversation. We also considered the ways in which art histories are growing with the increasing number of ethnocultural communities who are at home in diaspora and or unsettled racialized arrivants on just to everyone who has their computer, to make sure your computer is on mute. So, okay, so what's up? How can we understand the global South and global North not as binary categories, but as overlapping networks and territories without ever using the contentious terms? So that was actually an internal challenge that we had, which we went through yesterday. Exhibition pedagogy was something that we looked at, considered through the lens of the curators and artists of the exhibitions that are curated as part of this integral part of this project, to rethink ways and different ways we can offer more access for more diverse publics to post-colonial frameworks, and consider how the curatorial profession is intimately tied to the protection of not just intellectualized knowledge, but necessarily how it's accompanied by the felt knowledges. So what does it feel like to know? And so thinking of art ecology as an ecosystem also has the advantage of paying a nod towards more ecological thinking and creative praxis that can challenge the anthropocentric and Eurocentric fictions of epistemic totality. And so that is another challenge that we took up in ways in which we organized a conference. And so you would have seen sustainability ambassadors at your lunch hour, just to explain and promote that ethos and practice within our everyday lives. Certainly, so much has changed since WC became a project and held its many meetings. The world has changed, and what has increased is the stakes. How the stakes are amplified and intensified when we are engaging in storying pluriversal worlds and or worlding pluriversal stories, right? So what does it mean to decolonize worlding public cultures, or decolonizing the worlding of public cultures? What does it mean to displace the formerly Eurocentric concept from its place as a normative center of disciplines that are in the business of ensuring diverse publics have access to diverse cultures. Coming to the theme of today's session 5. What I wanted to bring attention to is also that we're trying to do this, but without the need to reject the concept of worlding and its more historical baggage, if you will, altogether, and still keep it in our midst to work itself sometimes just off center. And I wonder if it isn't where it's already has been for a very long time. And so we talk about leftist radical approaches, but we also need to definitely talk about the other extreme, if you will, the far right, or we could think about what we're sort of waiting for, we're bracing for it, that white lash, that white backlash, who would stealth-like continue to participate and in fact use the same rhetoric of world making, of practicing worlding according to white supremacist ideologies in the cases that I name. And so what is being worlded are in fact different worldviews, and one can also ask for worldviews that are very much intimately tied to the land. We have to ask if they were not always already worlded, and what is our purpose then for imposing this word. Someone used the word imposing yesterday. So today, we will continue by thinking of these two bastions of the art worlds, the museums and the archives. And then we're going to close out by going outside the doors of the academy, back into the community. And we are going to be at Opero, which is a change of venue, flagging that for those of us here in person, and which will turn the attention to artist-run centers, networks, and also public galleries that are very much in the same spirit as the Amsterdam Assembly, in fact, very active. We're active in seeking out opportunities for purposeful, courageous, principled engagement with the community in working on solidarity. So yesterday, Wayne mentioned that he was thinking about love. Where is Wayne? Oh. Hi. And it reminded me actually of the opening salvo of another conference to be held in Montreal by the American Studies Association, which is, they used actually a quote by Cornel West. And the conference title of their meeting is Solidarity, What Does Love Look Like in the Public? And this is what Cornel West wrote, or actually he said in a speech. Justice is what love looks like in public, just like tenderness is what love feels like in private. So now, please allow me to put on my moderator hat and to start session 5. I'll moderate this conversation with Jonathan Shaughnessy right there at the end. Jonathan is the director of curatorial initiatives at the National Gallery of Canada and completing his PhD studies in cultural mediations at Carleton University. And so what we're going to be doing is go back and forth a little, and then we're going to open the conversation with you in the audience. Just a tiny note from me that this is actually an important session at the intersections at the beginning of the second day, because this group combined is intersectionally, intergenerationally, nationally and locally, nationally, diasporic, and so many other dimensions, which we could have chosen a lot of directions. And so we're keeping it very loose to sort of work on this dream of the museum of the future, right? So, and also to complement the offerings that WPC project has over the 4 years, is that just some background that all the 4 academies, previous WPC meetings, were with and inside many major institutions, very prestigious institutions, the National Gallery of Canada, the Tate, Amsterdam, and I would say like Amsterdam was a bit hybrid, but then it was really hard to explain. So it was a hybrid event in Amsterdam. And then in Dresden, we were with the state museums there. It was wonderful. But here in Montreal, we thought we'd shake it up a little bit and not be affiliated with the museum at all, right? So in a way, sort of going rogue. And it's kind of nice to be in a position where we can critique in a way that wouldn't be possible if you were actually in the museum that was hosting you. Right. So, yeah, Jonathan.
Is that when you turn it over to me?
Yeah, did you want to say some opening welcome remarks?
It's great to be here, not in the museum. No, I'm at the university. No, I graduated from Concordia, so I love. And I've actually spoken in this room before as a graduate, and it's always wonderful to be back. In addition to being Montreal, so it's great to be here from the unsurrendered, unceded Anishinaabe Algonquin territory, where I live in what is now Ottawa. I live on the just outside of Ottawa in an the earliest settlement, Aylmer, Quebec, English settlement on the Quebec side, and on the banks of the Kitchissippi River, the Ottawa River, the Great River. So it's yeah, here, but it's great to be here. So, and back to you.
Yeah.
And you're going to start
All
your
right.
introductions.
So we're going to introduce our wonderful guests here. So to my left is Paul Goodwin, who is a professor and UAL Chair of Contemporary Art and Urbanism, and also the director of the Research Center for Transnational Art, Identity and Nation, also called TRAIN, at the University of the Arts, London. And to Paul's left is Eunice Belidal, who is a fellow Montrealer, born and raised here. Eunice is a curator, letter writer, critic, and researcher, and also an affiliate assistant professor in the Department of Art History at Concordia University, where I am. Good colleague.
And I will introduce to my near right, Jennifer Carter is professor of new museologies, intangible heritage and cultural objects in the Department of Art History and graduate museology program at the Université de Québec à Montréal. And Abigail Sellis, Sellis is an assistant professor in art history and museum studies at the Université de Montréal.
So we thought we would start with Paul and Eunice, and just ask you, could you talk a little bit about your research directions over the years and maybe also a bit about your research creation, because you're both curators. And Eunice, I also know that you have a creative practice as well. So Paul, would you like to start?
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. Well, first to say it's great to be here. And also, yesterday we went on a fantastic trip to Articule, I think. So I think you were director. Yeah. And for me, it really was inspiring. The exhibition itself was really inspiring, but also the space, because it kind of reminded me, and I immediately connected with it because it summed up the ethos of the space, the history of the space, what the space was has been achieving in telling the stories that have been repressed, or bringing to fore marginalized voices, etc. Has been something which I've been working on for a number of years in terms of my own sort of research, practice-based research within art and curating. And I would say in terms of my research orientations, they're probably around, I would mention two areas that I think I've focused on, which is both kind of practice-led or practice-based. One is thinking within the museum context or within the institutional context, and thinking about how to subvert that position. And I've kind of I borrowed a term from a Zimbabwean art critic and professor in the UK called George Shearing, who I heard speak at a conference, international conference on art in Africa, contemporary art in Africa, at the National Gallery of Zimbabwe. And at that conference, there was a lot of talk about a lot of young curators and other curators talking about curating being a form of storytelling, and that we're telling stories. And this is really important because we're telling stories which have been repressed, etc. But then George, who is a good friend and is also quite a provocateur, said that curating, or what he called curatoriality, we talked a bit about this when we discussed, what he called curatoriality is actually more than a form of storytelling, right? He was saying that curating or curatoriality, is imbricated in various forms of power, right? It's represented by the art market, actors, museums, and also a kind of disturbing cult of personality. So that needs to be kind of critically examined and kind of, torn apart. And so for my part, I look at George Sheary's idea of curatoriality in relation to, I think, the way that the role of the curator in the art world become almost so powerful and so ubiquitous in the global art world that it's become a kind of a semi-autonomous form of meta-discourse about art in its own right, some of which is really useful and really powerful to talk about art in that way, some of it quite problematic and uncritical. And often it becomes divorced from the work of art itself. And that's something that I've tried to address in my work, because a lot of Black artists and PLC artists tend to, their work tends to be over-determined by curatorial discourse about fitting it in frame of, diversity or decoloniality or whatever. And sometimes that the work gets lost. So I've been developing over the last few years, part of this critique of curatoriality has been to develop something that I've called uncurating, which is another, I didn't invent that term, another borrowed term from a colleague of mine at UAL called David Toot, who's a sound art professor and also a curator. And the way that I interpret curatoriality is through the idea of, uncurating is through the idea of developing what I call a recalcitrant posture towards curating. In other words, pushing back against dominant ideas of curating and trying to subvert it in many ways, a bit like the formulation of Stefano Hani and Fred Moten in Undercommons, when they talk about being in but not of an institution. I'm in an institution, but I'm not of it. So how do I kind of balance and negotiate that inside and outside situation? So a lot of my work has been around that and about developing forms of resistance and self-reflection in the forms of, to go against some of the dominant norms of quote unquote curating. And in some respects, I think, we've come to a moment, Document 15, we went to Document 15, and which was a really interesting exhibition. And to me, that I feel possibly marked the end of a certain kind of, this curatoriality discourse, right? It was really interesting that it was marked by the absence of that meta discourse about trying to kind of fit artworks into a particular predetermined model. And it was actually a much more distributed model. There were problems with that came about, that curatorial democratization, but it was definitely a very different experience. Curating became somewhat in the background. It wasn't the primary thing which you see. And I think that model of curatoriality, in some ways, there's been some fantastic, I'm not totally against it, because there've been some fantastic exponents of that. People like Caroline Christopher-Kargiev or Okreen Rizor, for example, incredible reinventions of the exhibition format, pushing it to its limit. I feel as though those limits have now been passed. The ways that curatoriality has been imbricated, particularly the art market, has really, I feel, meant that we need to kind of reinvent that model and actually do something much more bottom up rather than top down, which maybe we could call a form of worlding, perhaps, I don't know. So that's something that I've been thinking about for quite a while in a number of projects, which I've run out of time to talk about, and I've got 3 minutes. But I mean, a number of projects I've been working on specifically. Probably one which was specifically trying to test this idea of uncurating, or what I call a kind of curatorial minimalism, was a project called Untitled, Art on the Conditions of Our Time, which was at 2017 at New Art Exchange in Nottingham in the UK, and traveled to Kettle's Yard in Cambridge, which was a show with 10 African diaspora British artists. And there was no curatorial theme as such, which is why it was called kind of Untitled. And we just really, and each iteration of the show, we had different configurations of how we showed the works in collaboration with the artists. And the idea was really to make the work speak for themselves. You can look online, there's, especially in the Kettle's Yard website, there's lots of documentation of the show. And yeah, that was kind of, for me, a way of trying to move away from this over determination of artists' works. That's one example. I've got others, but I think I'll probably hand over to you.
I took so many notes from what you were saying, because I feel like when we're going to open it up to the conversation, there's a lot of things that are going to like bounce in between ideas. I am also very happy to be here and to also see Contre-archives under my name here. And one thing that I wanted to start mentioning is I never knew that, oh yeah, so how does this work? I just have to, yeah.
Click here.
Okay.
Voila. Oops, yes.
Oh yeah, that's me. So I put slides at random because I thought we were going to need them, but
Do you want me to click?
oh yes, please, just
Yeah,
click. Yeah, there's no order. So so it's good that it's starting with this, because this is one of the exhibition I curated at Articule, and I hear a lot of people talk about what I did when I was at Articule, but I never knew what I was doing until I left the center. And I still have a hard time understanding the impact that I had in the institution, because a lot of people are talking about it. Oftentimes, especially the exhibition that's happening right now, people are looking at me a lot when they're talking about that exhibition, but I have very, very little to do with it, except for maybe, I don't know, putting people in place to say yes to that type of projects. When I started working in the arts, I don't know if you remember this, Alice, you were my independent study teacher, and I was looking specifically into creating a contemporary art history with Haitian artists based in Montreal. And it was really at that moment that I realized that what I really wanted to do in arts is talk about people that I was not seeing, but also not understanding why I was not seeing them. So this is how I started to look into, because I'm from Haitian descent, it was very easy for me to use Haiti as like an entryway for that type of work. But then when I started working at Articule, I think that the way I like to describe it is that I understood the assignment, meaning that the mandate of the center was to look into give space to emerging artists, but also look into established artists that wanted to experiment. We were also socially engaged. So the two words that I always kept in mind was socially engaged and experimentation. And so whenever I was selecting projects with the committee, I didn't really care if I didn't know the artist that was submitting. Whatever was important for me was that they were experimenting, and that some of what they were talking about was linked to social justice. But I never really felt like I was doing something particular, like I was not going to work as an activist and I'm socially engaged in my work. It wasn't really that way that I was looking at it. And then now I look at the exhibitions and also the people that are working there. I'm very happy that, you know, there are other after me at Articule, because most places that I've worked at, whenever I was always the first, but whenever I left, I was not always replaced. So I'm happy that Articule is a different example So that is what I wanted to mention with the Articule. A good example of a project that we presented at Articule was artist Karen Tam, who is from Montreal. And when we saw Karen's submission, we were like, oh my God, like Karen is like, she's a big shot. Like, why would she want to apply to an artist run center? But then she really wanted to try something. And then ever since that project, I mean, I feel like it was a pivot for how she is creating her work and the different project that she's doing right now. And now she has work at museums, and I mean, people still know who Karen Tam is, so, you know. And she has a show at the McCord now, so, and you know, she's really, you can associate an artist like Karen Tam to a museum space, which you will not necessarily see before. And so this is the part about my time at Articule. And then I worked at the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, which will be saved for the later discussion. But yeah, the current research that I'm doing right now was actually started when I worked here at Concordia. I was working at the Fofa Gallery right in front of this room. And the pandemic happened. So there were works in the gallery that were stuck inside, and you know, we didn't know when we were going to have access to the gallery anymore. And then fall 2020 happened, and even if still we're starting to reopen, the Fofa Gallery was still not open because it also has a door going outside. So it was better for Concordia to distribute kits to students because of the two doorways. So because of that, I never could access the actual gallery space. And then I started thinking about what happens to an exhibition if there is no exhibition space. Like, does the exhibition exist still? And I was really trying to, you know, ponder about that idea, because I mean, I still had a job to do and I still wanted to do it, but I didn't have any space to do it. So I started, and you know, artists were writing emails to me saying how they were supposed to have that show on that date, and you know, what is going to happen to their career if the show is not happening. And I noticed that everyone had a lot of anxieties about, you know, their actual work. And then I decided to, and I felt like it was very similar amongst everyone. So I invited them to write a letter that we would distribute in our newsletter, just because at the time I didn't want people to be like bombarded with images. And I felt like, you know, online viewing was not the way of object or an artwork. And so I decided to ask the artists to write a letter about, you know, what they were asking me, but also what they were hoping would happen when everything would open up. And then I realized that you could care and share and, you know, talk about an artist in other ways than just using their work. And so that's how my letter writing practice started. And I'm looking at letter writing as a way to archive, but also looking at archives as an effective thing, rather than like it not being like logical or academic and then not valuable. And so yeah, that's how it all started. And I'm still like, now I'm using both of them to like nourish my curatorial practice. And this was also linked to storytelling, because I feel like what you say when you write a letter is completely different than what you would say if you talk to someone, or if you write an artist statement or a curatorial statement. So what are the things that you allow yourself to say in a letter that you can't keep or, you know, present publicly? So all of those things are like things that I'm looking into with my current letter writing practice. So yeah, I think that sums it up.
All right, thank you. And I think we're going to bring it over to this side and sort of turn to scholars who are looking at museums and institutional spaces. But I just wanted to say, I think that Eunice, I mean, there are two models there around curatoriality, like the letter writing and there's lots to talk about. So I'm taking copious notes. And I missed it at the beginning, but I wanted to really thank very much for the invitation to this panel, Alice, and to Ming and to Paul for the WPC conference and all of the organizers. I didn't say that right off the bat. Thank you so much. So now we're going to turn to, I think, could we start maybe, Abigail? I think it might make sense because I think in your work, you're looking at the politics of museums and art festivals and other spaces, but also have a curatorial frame within your work, I think, a lot of the time.
Yeah, sure. So can everyone hear me okay? Great. So I also want to thank everyone for the invitation to be in this panel and this conversation. And I'll also try to pick up some threads from conversations that were started yesterday. Starting perhaps, I guess the broadest way to present my research is that I examine the afterlives of colonialism in contemporary Francophone culture and society, and I look most particularly at France. And I do that by looking at visual culture. I do that by looking at museum politics and practices, and I also do that by looking at the work, at creative works that engage with these ideas, that speak back to museums that are sometimes in but not of the museum, as Paul said. But I'm also not an art historian. Don't tell anyone that, because I'm in the Department of Art History. But I just signal that because it's something that came up yesterday with Wayne's comment about how do we work across these disciplines and how do we bring in, not how does worlding public culture think not only from the place of art history, but across disciplines and divides. So my training was in French and Francophone studies. So I mentioned that not just to tie in for yesterday, because that also influences how I think about art. Oh, sorry. It also influences how I think about art in that I define it as the skillful expression of creative thoughts in many forms and mediums. And it also defines how I think about museums, because I'm looking for museum functions and practices that appear in unlikely places, in mundane and everyday places, but also in different types of cultural productions that are not at all associated with museums. So that kind of informs how I was thinking about this question of better museums, better futures. What are the worlds we can create for and from museums? And I think the other thing about working on kind of a French space when looking at museums is that the state of conversations are radically different than what we see in Canada and in the US, I think to some degree in the UK as well, where whereas here in a Canadian, Quebecois, US context, these words of like diversity, equity, inclusion, decolonization have become buzzwords, have become things that institutions are rewarded for addressing, and sometimes that ends up being instrumentalized in lip service, as I'm sure you can speak to better than I can. But it's something that is actively talked about and that institutions have motivations for adopting in their curatoriality, in their public programming, and also the programs. That's not the case when you're looking at French institutions, where it's very much a taboo subject. And there's this idea, particularly in the art museum, that you do have to abstract from the body, to pick up another conversation from yesterday, that your body, your identity cannot be part of artistic analysis or practice or discussion, because then it's no longer aesthetic, it's no longer art. So I say this not to, create this narrative of progress where like, oh, French institutions need to catch up to what's going on here. Not at all, but rather to point to this particular configuration and context and think about what we can learn from what museums have done and what activists and cultural workers have done in that context. What are the practices and political possibilities that come out from those conditions and configurations and constraints? And so on the institution side, one interesting thing to note is that while it's very difficult to talk about race and racism in the context of museums, decolonization has in a way become a buzzword, but only if addressed through the context of restitution and repatriation. And more particularly restitution and repatriation between kind of France and the African continent. So it's interesting in that it kind of limits and racializes the conversation of decolonization to a very particular context. And it becomes difficult to speak intersectionally about these practices. But on the flip side, it means there is a lot of funding and support for researchers and institutions that want to embark on provenance research, that want to engage in projects that look at repatriation and restitution. And there are some projects that have been able to use that funding to ask really thoughtful and difficult questions about restitution and repatriation, and use that funding to center not the needs or interests of the French or European institutions involved, but the potential receiving communities, to think about the epistemologies that are being mobilized in potential receiving communities, and to understand what they want from these objects, how they're seeing these objects. So that's one interesting thing that we could go into during the conversation. And then the other is that this has kind of meant that there's a lot of really exciting, interesting work going on outside of the museum that is also concerned with questions of cultural interpretation, of memory transmission, of storytelling and histories, where there is a very robust conversation on decolonization, on equity, on anti-racism, that thinks in really intersectional ways, that draws on feminist research, and that communicates and engages in the public through different forms of media that are not museums, but are things like podcasts and YouTube channels, and alternative guided tours of exhibition spaces, like when there was the exhibit Le Modèle Noir, the Black Model, at the Musée d'Orsay. The collective Décolonisons les Arts organized this unofficial, unsanctioned guided visit of the museum, where they went through and kind of critiqued and thought about this attempt of a museum to address some of the questions of race and representation that ended up kind of re-entrenching certain stereotypes and ignoring the contemporary work of Black identified artists in France. So there's things like that really the podcast scene is fascinating. There's projects like Histoires Crépues, that's a YouTube channel that talks about Black histories in France. Sur les traces de Désirée is a kind of autobiographical podcast where a woman named Désirée traces the history of her great-grandmother who immigrated from Martinique to Paris, and of whom very little is said about in her family because of her tragic death. And a podcast about souk, so a musical tradition that again thinks about souk in its political and cultural implications. And so all of these practices, I think, offer us ways to think about knowledge and memory transmission in ways that are polyphonic, that are matrilinear, that are pluriversal, that are intersectional, and that are not object-oriented, but that could be brought into museum practices in interesting ways, to think about how to world museums and world the curatorial and address and imagine a better future for museums. So I turn it over to Jen.
Thank you very much. Merci aux organisateurs et de cet événement. Merci à ma collègue Elitan Pajot. Je me rappelle du courriel que j'ai reçu il y a à peu près un an pour l'invitation pour m'intégrer à ce panel. conversations we've had over the last few days. Thank you. And I feel very lucky to be learning alongside you and being a part of this. So the research that I have been conducting for the better part of 10 years now has to do with the emergence of a different kind of museum. And I want to take the time to ground that museum because it's very different. I've been looking at the emergence of human rights museums. And given that the idea of the museum is a colonial construct, you might wonder about what a human rights museum is. Well, we have one in Canada, one of two new national museums in the last 40, 50 years alongside our Immigration Museum. And both of these are located outside of the capitals of Ottawa and Gatineau. But in fact, as I began questioning what a human rights museum is, I realized that there are many examples around the world that name themselves human rights museums and that have emerged post-millennial, with the exception of Japan, and important for that reason in the 1980s. So I began to question why these museums have emerged at this time, how they are interrogating the question of human rights, what they are dedicated to. And there are many of the examples that I've particular because they emerge out of significant violations of human rights, of political oppression, in sites of displacement of Indigenous peoples and communities, of genocide, of deterritorialization. So very difficult subjects. There may be collections, but collections is not the point of these institutions. And so the research that I have been engaging in visiting museums in Asia and South America in particular, but of course here in Canada as well, has aimed to understand these institutions within their local context. And so as you can they attend to very different things from many traditional art museums or history museums or science museums. Many of them have a tradition of what Paul Williams has called the Memorial Museum. Examples in the late 40s, mid 50s, but a large number of such museums evolved in the 1980s, and they have a very particular framework with a commemorative functions that are backward looking in terms of how we understand the wrongs of the past. But what's interesting is how, with the rise of social justice and human rights discourses, both in grassroots organizations and transnational levels, how these two forms of discourses have informed a more recent generation of these museums that refer to themselves in their titles as human rights museums, because one is backward looking to honor the memory of victims of violations of the past, and forward looking, how do we use these museums as justice seeking opportunities. And so what we are noticing now is how these museums are doing different things, or perhaps doing things differently through this increased justice lens. And so looking at organizations that lie at the intersection of memorialization, but also social justice, has brought me to a number of different museums around the globe to do museum ethnographies, to meet with colleagues within these institutions, to ask them about what their practices are, to analyze the exhibitions, both permanent and temporary, that have been created in these sites, and to try to understand what is at the heart of this work. And I feel very privileged to have met so many engaged and activist curators and museum directors and docents and educators in these institutions to learn about the type of work that they're doing. And I've come to think about the role of this work as justice seeking and as bringing a measure of repair, and the type of work that not only exhibitions, but the programming that is related to these institutions is also achieving. So I was thinking about the term or the expression, Wayne, that was so evocative yesterday when you talked about worlds broken by historical wounds. And a number of these examples of exhibitions and museums that I've looked at are located in just these places where there are deep, deep wounds and the question of how to move on from them. But also, Ming, yesterday when you talked about art and the world openings, I'd like to think of exhibitions in these contexts as also a promise of world openings. I think of exhibitions as works, and very often exhibitions are realized by many people, not just the lone figure of the curator. It takes a village, Alice, as you were talking about this morning. In many of the instances that I've looked at, and I'm thinking in particular of an incredible exhibition called Voces para transformar al Colombia, or Voices to transform Colombia, which is the exhibition of a new national museum in Bogota, in Colombia, dedicated to the more than 6-decade internal armed conflict in Colombia, with all of its complexities, with all of its changing modalities over 6 decades. It's an exhibition that aims to get beyond what we often see in memorial exhibitions, which is a kind of victim oppressor binary, to get beyond that, and especially in the context of a national museum, I think this is important, to address structural mechanisms that are in place and to open upon a larger category of actors that help to maintain oppressive regimes and situations towards a kind of opening of dialogue for the people that are going to be visiting this National Museum when it is ultimately opened. And what is interesting about this particular exhibition is that it is the product of very deep research by an overarching institution, the Center for Historical Memory, in which a large number of sociologists, of anthropologists, of historians visited many different communities throughout Colombia that have been touched in different ways in different periods during the period of this armed conflict, to work with victims organizations, to work with members of these communities to understand what their experience of this these protracted violations have been, and to bring these back in the form of an exhibition that was structured metaphorically. So it was a very open-ended exhibition that questioned what war does to the body and what bodies do in war, that questioned what war does to water and waterways and what water does to war, and that questioned what war does to land and what land does in war. And across these 3 axes, the structure that was given to this exhibition, the work of different victims groups was profiled. And what was so interesting, and it was the product of collaborative work, but what was so interesting was the way visitors to this exhibition that was launched as a way of showing what the museum was planning to do, even though the museum doesn't exist yet in bricks and mortar, the way Colombians from across the country came and appropriated this space and just spontaneously began to speak in front of the works that represented their contribution to this exhibition, taking ownership of the exhibition as something that far exceeds the work of an already activist and dedicated museum team that is a curator, but also education and digital. It was their work, in addition to the work of researchers, in addition to the work of community members themselves. So I have other examples too, but this one stands out to me as something that is really important. And I think a measure of its importance is that at one point, this traveling exhibition began to be, with the change of government, you can well understand how the aims of a particular institution risk being changed, and they were. The minute you go, well, Alice, you asked us to talk about right wing and left wing. And so the minute there's a change of government in Colombia, the aim and vision of this National Museum has also been changed and jeopardized. And this occurred while this exhibition was traveling. And so the question of how to preserve the methodology of this exhibition, of this important exhibition, was taken to court, and it was decided that it was very important to respect the contributions of of victim groups and how they have worked with these with the museum team in order to keep integral the process of the methodology of the exhibition itself, which I think is one form of justice seeking. So I'll leave it with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer, Abigail. Alice, I think we're going into another round, but how's our timing and stuff? Should we just have a...
We're going to go, actually, I probably should have said this at the beginning. So because of a glitch in timing, we're actually, this session will go long for 15 more minutes or so. Yeah, so we do have a bit of time. Yeah. So we're moving into our second round. Thank you so much for those introductions and to your research. And this is so deep and profound, and already I'm taking tons of notes. Yes.
Oh, voices. Voice, well, in English, because my Spanish accent is so terrible, but Voices to Transform Colombia. Thank you.
There's so many questions and so many things that we can ask each other. Okay, so the main prompt for our conversation was actually to ask you to speak candidly to your thoughts on the keywords of the session title that we forgot to announce, which is Museums, Better Practices, Better Futures. And we thought you could think to your experiences or your field notes or aspects of your research or research creation on this public-facing institution of the museum. What have been some better practices for museums in relation to culturally diverse communities, decolonizing institutions, and social justice? And clearly your research is so profoundly connected to these issues. And so we could sort of go back this way and ask Pauline Muniz, based on your experiences and field notes, what have been some better practices for museums? Or maybe I should just ask, based on your experiences and for both of you as curators of color, how can museums be better? Tell us your stories.
I probably have a longer experience than I do, so I would invite you to start.
How long have we got? So I'm normally quite sort of pessimistic about this. Everyone's heard me speak before. I'm kind of quite pessimistic about the future of the museum in some respects, and that's partly because of my work with the encounter of Black art with museums, or Black artists with museums, which is a long history and very problematic. And if in many respects, the museum needs to be reinvented completely. If not, something else needs to emerge. But today I'm really positive. And, and just talk really briefly, just mention a few points about things that I think trends that are actually happening at the moment, and some projects that happened in the past that I think actually really interesting, right? So one is about, I think that Black curators and POC curators are actually reinventing the paradigm of curating in Europe. Right now, it gives two examples about that. Rahila mentioned yesterday about the marginalization, quite correctly, the marginalization of Black women artists, you know, within WPC, but also within you know, wider research circles and art circles. And I think that's very true. But what's happened in the UK, there's been a fairly quiet but significant shift in the number of Black women curators and museum directors, which I'm not sure if people are aware of. So just to give you a few examples, we have Eva Langret, who is director of Frieze Art Fair, which is the world's biggest art fair, right, in London. Sepaki Angiyama at INOVA, the International Institute for International Visual Arts, is a very well-known international curator, and she's director of INOVA, and really reinventing the model of how INOVA worked. Doesn't work in exhibitions, it's research-based. It works with artists, younger artists, and researchers. and works around really interesting theoretical models, drawing on, for example, Glissant and others. Zoe Whitley is director of Chisenhale Gallery, which is an important gallery in London, small, experimental, and she's making waves, bringing in new voices there. Ghislaine Tawadros is director of the Whitechapel, which is one of the most important public galleries in the world. And Ghislaine was the director, the founding director of Innova. So you can see the shift there. Amal Khalaf is director of the Cubic Gallery and Residency, which is an important curatorial residency, which gave opportunities to many young curators, including a collective called Languid Hands, who are a really important curatorial collective, who are now directors of the 118 Gallery, the 118 Contemporary Arts and Learning Gallery in Brixton, which is a really important Black-led space. And they're completely changing the paradigm around POC, queer, LGBTQ practice, and translating that into curatorial practice in a really interesting way. Melanie Keane is director of the Welcome Collection, which is a huge and massively rich collection, but also problematic. And she's really, she was also a director of Innova, and is again really changing that institution in quite interesting ways by looking at the history of racism in medicine and in the collections, and really quite radically opening that museum in different directions. I could go on, right? This Bolanli, a young woman I've mentioned, Bolanli Tajuddin, is very young, graduate of UAL, set up an organization called Black Blossoms. I'd urge you to look at it. Black Blossoms. I think it's blackblossoms.com, but if you look at it, they're a curatorial collective, set up an online art school. And again, it's really driven through Black feminism and Black female practices, and has a course which was a kind of a huge success at Tate called Art in the Age of Black Girl Magic. Has been extremely successful. So, and I know that there is a kind of, many of these women are involved in informal groupings, WhatsApp groups, talking about how to transform institutions and how to do this. And again, it's not really been talked much about in the art world, but I think it's something which is quite significant. And I think, as I mentioned before, I believe that the paradigm of curating is being changed. Other examples we can talk about, just really briefly, about Black curators and directors bringing new ideas and concepts in Europe, not just in the UK. Wayne, of course, the National Museum of World Cultures and the Research Centre for Material Culture is, we know, obviously in WPC, we know of his work, but he's really reinventing, I think, the ways that research operates within the museum, and also the idea of embedding activism into practice. So again, that's another great example. Charles Longver at the Stedelijk Museum is head of the curatorial. He's head of the curatorial department. Works works with the director, Reinwolfs, and again is really bringing in huge change to the museum in terms of the way that centering diasporic narratives within Dutch art. Anyone knows anything about Dutch art, this is a big thing. It's causing a lot of pushback. The white lash you mentioned is starting to come, and he's been, in some respects, he's coming under critique, but he's pushing on and doing really fantastic work there. Azu Nwabogu, another important curator, is head of the Stedelijk Museum Bureau, which I remember when I went to the Stedelijk Museum Bureau, which is a kind of an offshoot that focuses on the global of the Stedelijk. And it was run by a white curator. Before now, it's a duo, Azu and I can't remember the other curator, both black women who are running that center. Of course, Bonaventure Ndikung at Savvy Contemporary has been completely, has a hugely influential globally in the ways that Savvy has become a laboratory of form, ideas, etc., and really bringing performance into exhibition making, etc. And now is director of the House of World Cultures in Berlin, and has got an incredible, curatorial team and works in a very collective manner. So again, reinventing that model. I'd also mention Monica de Miranda, who's a Portuguese Angolan artist in Lisbon, I worked with her for many years. She's director of an institution called Hangar, which is again pushing decolonial and Black artists within Portugal. So, sorry,
You are a walking address book.
yes, I'm just saying that. I'm not saying. The reason why I'm mentioning quite a few of these examples is because one, I don't think they're being talked about.
Yeah.
And two, I think they're having significant implications. I mentioned that model, the Ockley model, is shifting into something else, and a much more and I think that's really sort of fascinating. Too long.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I just want to interject and ask
Oh,
the
please.
questions.
No,
I mean, I think one of the
Okay,
things
go
I could offer as a provocation to think on is how earlier you were mentioning how trying to uncurate, the model of uncurating and sort of breaking apart or this kind of curatorial elitism.
Yeah.
And here we have this resurgence, if you will, which we're experiencing, but a much more moderate. If you say that is quiet, ours must be like very, very soft. But we're experiencing something similar in Canada, and definitely in my books is one such figure who is part of this movement of Black Canadian curators now sort of emerging and appearing in institutions. And we do have our own powerhouses, such as Gaetan Verna, for example, coming from Montreal, but then also Juliette, and then at the power plant, and then at the Wexner. So really we could think of a lot of people too, right?
Like thinking of a model to look at too of Emily Schenger and what at the Agnes Etherington, when you talk about literally a building that's being built up, going to be turned down and built up differently in the
Yeah.
meantime, 2 years of community
But I think,
practices. But
I mean, there's so many things that we can interject, but one of the things is just to think about like the irony of like you have a curatorial cohort that is now emerging and trying to get their professional feet wet. At the same time where you have seasoned curators who are trying to like sort of break apart that model. And so I'm just like, where shall the two meet so that they can both sort of continue, right? And I know that Eunice's experience is very much about that. Yeah.
Could I just ask, just to come back with one quick example, really quickly, of what you just said, right? Which is there are some institutions or these which are adopting a kind of model of giving up power, but as in white curators giving up power, white directors giving up power.
Okay.
Right. So, for example, at the Live Art Development Agency in London, which is one of the big development agencies, or the principal development agency for live art performance work in the UK. Director Lois Corridon, who is director there for like 20 years, white woman, did fantastic work. From my understanding, realized that model needed to be changed, and now it's run by a collective of younger Black curators. I think 2 co-directors have been appointed there. Also, at Birmingham Museums have got now appointed 2 POC co-directors. So co-directorships are being put forward as a way of having a situation where, because often people are appointed to these jobs and then there's no infrastructure to support them, or there's kind of, they're kind of appointed and allowed to fail in a way, with no support.
Yes.
So the co-directorship model, I think, is quite interesting, but I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, I like that. I think it's a beautiful segue into what I have to say. But one thing that I want to mention about co-directorship is an example that, for me, doesn't necessarily show it as successful is when we have a defunct publication here called Canadian Art, and they used to have Indigenous editor. And then once that position was, no longer like the Indigenous editor that they had went on to have another job. So they reopened the position, but they hired 2 different editors so the pay was split in 2. And so oftentimes when I see a lot of like co-directorship, it's often a way to split the work in two and have, I don't know, sometimes there are some problems with it. I think it's a good model, especially coming from you know, I have an artist-run background, so I come from a structure that is horizontal. So I understand why it's a good model, but I don't have a lot of examples here in Canada where it has been successful. And I think for me, that was one of the things that made it complicated for me to navigate my time at a museum or like a museum institution. Was I came from a horizontal background where there was no real need for power. And I never really thought of my work as a way to have power. And I think that's also one of the reasons why I was not able to see why people really looked at what like my presence at Ethnocultural as having done something, because I feel like there are so many people involved in the decision-making and why the center was the way it was when I was there, that I have a hard time, you know, saying it that way. But when I arrive in a museum, you know, power is really important, and the idea of like the sacrosanct curator as like the ultimate voice. So that's why I was really excited to hear you talk about curatoriality, because that's most of what I experienced working there. And for me, it was very odd to only have those like two very different models to work with, and you know, not being able to understand one model and not being like, you know, supported in understanding that model was kind of a blessing in disguise, because I won't bring that type of model in my work in the future. But you know, if I have to ponder about the question about, you know, better practices for museums, one image I like to use as an example is you are invited to someone's house, someone is hosting you, and then most of the guests that are already in the house have eaten before because they're used to being in that house. They have, you know, they have habits in that house, so they're not hungry yet, but they're about to, because they're invited to a dinner, and then you're invited to dinner as well. So, you know, you don't know where you're going, so you arrive there, you're hungry, you know, you're ready to have a meal, and then when you get there, the host is telling you about this wonderful meal you're going to have, and then, you know, you're getting quite hungry because you hear what you're going to eat. And then at some point you realize that they're expecting you to make the meal, and you're like, oh, okay. So then you go in the kitchen and you open cupboards that are empty, and you're like, okay, I'm like depleting myself of energy because I'm looking for food that I don't know where it is, and I'm super hungry. And then you end up making a meal with the crumbs that you have found in the house, and then the host is expecting you to pay for the meal that you had. So this was a good way to explain my experience at the museum. And for me, the idea of hosting is always very important in the way I look at curating, because when I was working at, you know, at Concordia and at Ethnocultural and the different independent curatorial project that I've made, you are in the house, like the institution or the gallery is your house, and you're inviting people over to be comfortable and to exchange and to give something, but you have to give them the resources to do that. So I think one of the better practice of an institution is to be able to provide the food, but also just like think where or how you want to have people over at your place. I think this idea of hosting and giving is a beautiful way of understanding institutions, because oftentimes when I was moving from the artist run to the you know, institutional museum environment, they were looking at community as a currency. And then, you know, you also have to look into these institutions as ways of becoming anti-capitalist. So there's not one person holding all the resources. There is, you know, what you want from people is not only what they can bring to you, but also what you can bring to them and how you can nourish, you know, each other. And also not looking at money as the driving force of your decision making, because oftentimes it makes for very incoherent decisions, especially for someone that is not really aware of how to make decision in the environment that they have been like placed into. And one thing that I want to like end on is, from the very little amount of time that I was at the museum, I noticed a very, very clear difference between the Black artists that were invited as artists in the institution and the Black curator that was working there. So there was a, you know, as curators, we're always interested in caring for the artist's message and ideas, but when you use, like, you know, Blackness and social justice as a currency, then you only look at it you know, based on what it does to you. So, you know, there will always be a difference between how invited artists are treated, because they are the ones that are going to, you know, give you, you know, all of the entries at the museum and, like, you know, the money that comes from having these exhibitions. But the Black curator that is, like, you know, alone and not knowing what to do, they can't really bring you anything. So you don't really care about, you know, you don't really care about them or the ideas of, you know, there's a hierarchy of which Blackness is needed in the institution. So.
Thanks, Eunice. I feel like there really is so much here, and I keep writing a question down, and then it gets to the next part of the conversation. I think, no, but I think that Eunice, and you've been very generous in your thoughts in the hyperallergic article that I know, and here as well. And also interestingly complimentary to saying everybody was nice. Everybody was, you know, it wasn't as though, but there was something, and I know there's a lot of conversations in big institutions around how do you make that space to ensure. I think a lot of it does come down to questions as well of care, and that's I think grounding your practice. But maybe, I don't know, I'd love for and also I think your window, artist run University Art Gallery, major institution. I don't know what's next, but you've got the ecology is growing, so you've got your independent maybe for a bit, and then but I wonder if, like, to me there's so many things that are running through the better practices, a lot of, I think, this idea of, I think from curatoriality, I think this model of, is there a model of better practices in which that kind of, because I totally had what's being said about curators. I think in a collecting institution as well, there can often be there's siloization. There's sort of like, if you're responsible for collection, there can be sort of ownership issues over that collection and how it's presented. These are things that need to be worked through. And then I think a lot of things have to do with this question of community. I love what you say too about community as currency. I think this is a huge, you know, this is problematic in many ways, but also, is it not that how do you, are there curatorial better models in which, and I know I've seen them, and I've seen them often in education departments, radical curating of community in mind that are bringing it to the museum. You know, I think there's evidence at the Hammer in Brooklyn where there's really great collaborations to kind of reach community. So that's something, but could we maybe, where do we place these questions of access? Jennifer, the model you just gave from Columbia seemed to be very much driven by community. And I didn't quite get if that was also art within that or a different type of exhibition. But I wonder, Abigail and Jennifer, if you've seen models in which we kind of break down some of these silos or questions of access, or I mean, and responding to this great conversation.
Yeah, that was a good question, and thank you, and just amazing ongoing conversation. The exhibition I was talking about, as I mentioned, comes from a very different place, but yes, combines different works of art, different informative pieces about different communities' experiences during a very prolonged conflict. But maybe I could also bring up another example because often these museums have been, well, I mean, museums are imagined by many different people, right? By funders, by governments, by creative curators, by communities, and many of the examples that I've looked at have emerged in transitional justice situations, where often museums are named as an important element in transitional justice mechanisms without giving concrete measures of how these museums should develop. And another example that I found quite interesting, and the context is very specific. It's in South America, in Paraguay, where there was a commission, but not a truth and reconciliation commission, as we often hear, but truth and justice. And I think that is a really important distinction. Before we ever think about reconciliation, it's a question of justice by getting at the truths that are not out yet. And so not only was this commission, unfortunately, underfunded initially and needed to be prolonged and was prolonged, but so many people committed to this work are involved in just getting the stories out and shared. And in this context, I visited, and I find this so interesting, small landlocked country. In its capital, there are not one, but two human rights museums. And I use that term in a very large sense because one of them is ostensibly a documentation center, and I'll segue to the next panel, an archive, but also has a museum component. And by that, they mean a small space where exhibitions can be mounted. But the heart of that particular institution is the archive, and it is the archive of the former dictator who had as far as I know, the longest dictatorship in South America from the 50s to the 80s, Stroessner's archive, that people are now invited to go and visit and learn from and find what documentation was mounted on them if they are former political prisoners, for example. So I think that element in terms of justice seeking, of gaining access to information, this is not the only example of a museum archives at Chile and its foundations, that its National Museum of Memory and Human Rights also has a very important archival component. But to return to Paraguay, what is interesting is that we're talking about ecosystems. I think that's a very powerful metaphor, but so too is the idea of constellation. And in this city, as I mentioned, in this small city, there are two museums dedicated to human rights. And the second addresses also the dictatorship, but according to very different means. And I think this idea of different institutions performing different functions is a really strong way of thinking about how to come to terms with the past, how to move forward in terms of societal reckoning, but also the kinds of responsibilities. And here I turn to the writing of Roger Simon, the kind of responsibilities that are conferred not only on exhibition makers, but visitors to these exhibitions too. And I'm thinking of his book, Pedagogy of Witnessing, because we inherit responsibilities when we visit exhibitions too. And that element, I think, is worth thinking about as well.
Yeah, so can I just ask a question about
Did not Abigail wanted to?
Oh, sorry.
Okay,
Okay, no, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Jennifer. That's, and all of you, I'd say, I feel like I keep writing questions. Want something else. But I think perhaps a bit like Paul and Eunice, I'm more used to approaching museums from a place of critique. So I was very compelled by the keywords of this panel of thinking better museums, better practices. But it was so much easier to think of counter examples. But what I've been trying to do is kind of name and signal the places and begin to imagine practices that could make better museums, better futures. And so one of the things I've been thinking about is when museums bring in communities or want to collaborate, is how, like, what are the methods and mechanisms we can employ to create a lot of room for refusal? Like, how do we make it really easy to not consent, to say no, to agree, but then retract that agreement, to put limits on what we're asking participants to do? And again, I don't have models for that, but as a kind of shift in from thinking of like, oh, let's get the consent to like, let's make it really easy to say no. Like, let's not look for the yes, let's ask for something, but make it really, really easy to say no or to change the terms. The other thing I've been thinking about is institutional and intergenerational entitlements, because I think museums have been thinking a lot about, institutional intergeneration trauma and how there are spaces that can activate these histories of pain without realizing or addressing so directly the ways that museums and museum workers carry institutional and intergenerational entitlement, and how even inhabiting a position, even if you're coming from a background that is marginalized, once you're in the position of power, there's ways in which you may unconsciously repeat some of those entitlements of the museum. And so how do we create a vocabulary for talking about that? How do we become aware of it? How do we call it out, call it in, and try to deconstruct that? And also thinking about the way museums are holders of such resources, not just of knowledge, but of material and financial resources. Of course, that depends on the type of museum. But again, this is something that I was seeing more as I was examining the different partnerships that were happening between museums and potential receiving communities in these conversations about repatriation and restitution between France and African countries. How there were some instances where the institutions realized the wealth of resources they had and thought about how do we use this partnership to transfer some of that wealth to, rather than build up the knowledge and infrastructure we have through this partnership, how do we use the partnership to build up infrastructures and knowledge practices in the potential receiving communities along the terms that they set, along the interests that they have. And then the last thing is really one of the keywords you keep bringing up, Alice, which is this question of felt knowledge. And again, how do we move away from museums as places where we look at things to where we feel things, perceive things in all of their multisensory richness? And for that, I'm often influenced by artistic practice and the way artists, contemporary artists often do think about that question. And it's something that, to kind of go back to my own kind of curating or research creative practice, it's something that I work on with an artist named Cosmo White on a project that we have called the Catalog of Speculative Translations, in which it started out as an interrogation of the relationship between the textual and the visual in museum spaces, particularly in the African art and ethnographic collections in France. So what is the relationship between the text label and the object that we see? And so I did a series of, kind of false translations of these labels from French into English, and sent them to Cosmo, who didn't look at the object they were referring to, and created compositions and collages based on what he was reading and kind of drawing from his own Jamaican background and diasporic background. And so we kind of wanted to highlight that relationship between the textual and the visual in museums and start to think about it otherwise. And in the next stages of the project, we're really trying to bring in sound and other forms of sensorial experience. And again, this is still an art project. It still is very conventional in some ways, but it's a place where we're starting to experiment with felt knowledge and what that might look like in museum spaces.
Thank you so much. Well, did you have a
No,
question?
it's fine. No, it's fine. Yeah, it's fine. Let's move on.
Yeah, I think this is actually now a good point, time to ask if you have any questions for each other, so that ask away, now's the time. Or maybe
And do we have because I'm thinking, or the audience, if
Yeah.
we're So are we till 11:15?
How long do we have?
We have about 10.
Oh, we still have 10 because it's 11. Oh, we're going to 11:30 or? Oh, 11:30.
Oh, okay.
Oh, so we got. I think it was referring to Jennifer.
Might take us down a rabbit hole.
Oh.
We have 10 more minutes.
10 more minutes, okay.
So yes, so if you have the questions or if there are questions from the Zoom chat, please ask away. But also, of course, if you have any. Yes.
Oh, do-
Do we need to run a mic?
I can give.
There should be a mic there. Yeah, okay. Thank you. David, thank you.
Sorry, I think it will be a long question. But thank you so much for the wonderful examples about how to make systems better. And Paul, I was thinking about your example about how in the UK scene, more leadership roles are being filled by Black and POC people. And similarly in the US, that happened, and it was great to see that happen. But I also noticed that so many of these people who are filling these leadership roles, who are Black and POC, are actually people who are strongly affiliated with white institutions. And it's pretty much the same with the exhibitions that claim to have diverse artists. For example, if they say like 80% of the artists in this exhibition are Black and POC, but you really look into it and 80% of those, 90% of those 80% are people who did their MFA at Yale or something like that. So I feel like these leadership positions are being filled by people who are vetted through a white gaze. And I'm wondering if you have any ideas about how we can take this even further and take the next step to make sure that there's a way to fill these leadership roles without having people having to go through this vetting phase through a white gaze.
Yeah, that's a great question. But I think that the only way to do that is to change society. You know, meaning we live it, you know, in the UK, the cultural infrastructure is in terms of the publicly funded cultural infrastructure is controlled by the white gaze, no doubt about that. Some of the curators I mentioned are directors of Black run and Black created organizations such as Innova, for example, or the 198 Gallery of Brixton, which is a fantastic space, which I urge you to look at their website. They've got a long history. They go back to the 80s and are still going, and they've expanded. And so these are not institutions that are from the white gaze. They're actually coming out of Black radical practices, right? And there are others I could mention across the UK as well. We haven't got the time for me to go into all of that. So, but your question is a good one, and that it addresses what I was talking about earlier, which is how do you inhabit as Black curators, as Black intellectuals within these spaces right here, right now? How do we navigate that question of being in but not of, right? And trying to subvert the dominant structures that we inhabit and to try to have other stories.
Just for clarification, we have to give them.
Oh, we did. Okay. Well, that might be somebody, another. Oh, did.
Well, you know, I'm glad I'm going before Wayne rather than after. But also because he's a good example of what I'm about to say, which is that, you know, I don't think that we can necessarily imagine that these institutions are always going to stay white and that they're going to stay, you know, unchanged. And part of our task here is actually not just to build alternative institutions, but also to make interventions and to make changes to the institutions that were previously coded through a white gaze. So I think that that's an important thing to remember, that although the master's tools will stay, one cannot use the master's tools, but they will not stay loyal to the master forever, right? That we can appropriate them, we can use them. It's not necessarily going to be the case that these are unchangeable institutions. I think I'll just stop there. I have other questions for each of you individually, but there's not a whole lot of time. And
so while the mic is being passed around, one thing that I wanted to mention to answer that question is, it's not because you have that like white stamp of approval, like having an MFA from Yale, that your experience is the same as a white person that has an MFA from Yale. So although you have that, it doesn't mean that that your experience is the same, that offers you the same type of value. So we also need to be mindful about that. The experiences and the meaning of those things are not the same for the same people.
Can I just on that as well? And I think there's a deeper, well, two very quick things. I don't want to go down wormhole, but I'm curious too, maybe for later conversation, Paul, in the context of Britain, I think about Black British cultural studies. I think about, all the work that has been done out of that. So I think that's going back decades of shifting an institutional pedagogical context in that sense. But also I think this is a good question, but it also, I think, raises very deep questions about how structural change takes place. And I think these are difficult ones. And you brought up, I think, about better practices and critical models. And I've been thinking a lot about this. If there is, and I think in a lot of institutions, from a curatorial especially, there's been forms of critique against a structure. And if you start to want to shift that through better practices, there's some kind of structural shift, critical shift that has to happen from not only critique, but praxis in a form of active engagement. And I think that's a very fine line, and that's where you say a whole shift has to take place, really a ground up. But I think it gets to what you're saying, Ming, about these structures aren't sacrosanct. They can be perceived that way, but I think we're in a very circular place if we keep them that way. So that's something I just wanted to say, but I think it brings up really interesting questions around structural change.
Well, Paul knows that I disagree with him in public all the time. So, no. First of all, Jennifer, just trying to tie a little bit with Eunice. One of the struggles that I have is that human rights discourse is still white discourse. It's still Western discourse. And therefore, I wonder, when one speaks about human rights discourse as discourse of justice, whose justice are we speaking about, and how does that think the institution differently? So there is a long history of critique of human rights discourse. So that's one thing. But I want to go to Paul. Because Paul knows that my next conference that I'm organizing, and if you all pay for it, we can all come, is going to be on exhaustion. I'm tired. Yeah. I'm exhausted. And so I wonder, in your iteration and your naming of so many people, beautiful people, what does that mean about any change? The institution is stubbornly persistent in a practice of burnout.
Yeah.
So how does it change that so many people take up positions if over the last 4 years under the decolonial nomenclature, so many people have taken up jobs and left them after 2 months, 3 months? So what does it say then that one can name all of this? These is the question that I'm asking to you. And how might we inaugurate something else beyond burnout? Beyond burnout. And I'd say this because I read Eunice's article. So, and that ties to my last point between hosting. And this goes back to Ming, but also Jenny's hosting and guests, because I think for me, the very problem in institution is that I'm always being hosted. Even when I'm a director, I'm being hosted by the rest of the organization. And they're welcoming me. And I'm constantly a guest that has to justify every single move that I make. So how might we inaugurate a different kind of institution where we either are all hosts of each other, all guests, but where it somehow belongs to all of us? Because it seemed to perpetuate my being an ongoing guest, even when I'm signing the check. My point, sorry. Hi, Paul.
I'm going to be really quick because I want to give the space to Eunice and others to speak. But Just a really quick response. In my opinion, I think Nikki's question was correct. In a white supremacist society, the institutions will always be white supremacist. Simple for me, right? So it's not going to change until the structures of society change. Until that happens, we do have to think about how, as Ming says, how we work with master's tools, but they are the master's tools and will remain so until the society changes, right? So how do we subvert that? How do we create other spaces? The other thing is we have to create our own spaces, which as I mentioned a few examples already of people that are doing that, and especially Gen Z, you know, Black Blossoms. It's not perfect, but it's an example of a young Black female curator who's created her own art school, basically, online. And it's growing and it's doing. Now, I've got some critiques of it. You know, this commercial thing, the use of social media as the main platform. You know, for me as an old person, it's like, what the hell? But you know, there is something going on. So, as I said, I prefaced my conversation in my intervention saying that I'm normally very pessimistic about the whole notion of curating in museums, right? And I still say that, but the shift that I have seen, people like yourself, Wayne, and others who are leading institutions and doing them other ways, creating new models, I know is definitely influencing younger curators who thought that was not possible even a few years ago. So I think we need to hold on to that.
And so because you have read the article, you might be aware of, at some point I'm saying that even if I was not creating any change while I was in the institution, I think I'm creating it by leaving the institution. And one thing that that really made me laugh was that there was a response from the only response from the museum was, they said, oh yeah, we're looking into the position, you know, to see if we can, you know, update it as a way that it's not as, you know, that much of a big position. But there were 4 other curators who had that position before me, and they all went through the same burnout. And I had to go publicly saying that it was, you know, saying what happened for them to be like, oh yeah, then, you know, we're going to look into it. So I think this is the beginning of the change, you know, mentioning that there is a historical burnout makes people aware that, okay, there are much more problems than, you know, than what we assume could be a problem with that type of institution. And one thing that I wanted to go back to was something you said, Jennifer, that I really want us to eventually have a discussion, even not in this setting, but the idea of responsibility. I think that is something that is extremely important, because it's not just like a giving and taking relationship, but you also have to think about what is happening afterwards. And you were talking about the responsibility of the visitor. And yeah, I think the responsibility is something that we should really take into account when we think about the future of the institutions.
Wayne's? Yes. Yeah, I mean, it's a very good point, Wayne. Obviously, I was not, how do I want to, what I was interested in looking at human rights museums is exactly how these institutions, first of all, why they referred to themselves as human rights museums in their titles, and in situations in Asia and Latin America, in Europe, in North America, and how that the concept of right is negotiated curatorially, pedagogically, semantically, architecturally. I mean, museums are such layered, complex spaces with so many different meanings that transcend the very idea of themselves at large. But I absolutely agree with you. It's a critiqued term. And so my question fundamentally was, why are we seeing the emergence of these museum types at this time over the last 20 years? But for that answer, each example that I looked at was deeply rooted in a local context and had its own reason for referring to often transnational discourses on human rights. So UN, among other things. Yeah.
And I just want to say, I really appreciate the complexity of this conversation that we're having, because I feel like we keep the invitation I hear from all of you is that we continue thinking and holding contradictory ideas in mind, that on the one hand, this work is impossible, and the other hand, that it's impossible not to try to do the work. And I really, really appreciate the complexity and the generosity with which you are all pointing to that and speaking to that.
I don't know if there's another, well, Abigail, you were the last one to speak, so I'm just going to say too, one thing that I was struck by when you were talking about a room for refusal. I think you're mentioning that, I think also about artists perhaps, or about perhaps, but I wondered if it doesn't also, something I was immediately thought of there is we enter into contracts, it's very legal, you know, and are there different forms of contractual agreements? I know it's something that we're looking at in contemporary art at the gallery. Often we also, and this is strictly about artists, living artists working in the institution. You kind of take for granted that depending on their level of career, whatever, they come into the place and they know how it works. There's no, you know, you come in, you don't know how the museum operates. You don't know you're going to be working with technicians. You don't know what the structures are, union and otherwise. So it's just, we're sort of looking at, is there actually a workbook that's necessary to sort of outline in a very quick way? And I don't know if there's any museums that have done that, but just to situate, and that gets into this model of care for also those who are entering in. And you know, it has to happen for anybody coming in, visitors, contractors, and of course the staff. So just nothing to respond there. It was just something I wondered if that shouldn't be put into almost a contractual framework in a different way.
Yeah, I think that's a really good, you know, to move from like theory and idea to practice. I think contracts are a great way to look at it. And I had another thought about that. Oh yeah, and that absolutely goes to this idea of host, how are museums actually good hosts? It's explaining how it works to people who don't know, who haven't been vetted, who haven't had all the steps. And that's also something I noticed when I was doing this study on like better practices for restitution and then repatriation, the idea that it's museums' responsibility to explain the process for making a request for restitution or repatriation, and it's their responsibility to be proactive in creating a process that's extremely transparent, that's extremely easy, that informs constituents and stakeholders on how this might work, and that's part of being, I think, a good host, equipping navigators.
I think the time has come. So thank you so much. There's no way this conversation, and already we have so many prompts and so many more questions that have been generated out of the, as you say, beautifully, the complexity and the multi-layered conversations here. And for myself, I really picked up on the intimate relationship between museums and pedagogy, speaking here, and also in my own work to think of different ways that we can continue to ensure that there is a kind of inclusive pedagogy that's going to respect different worldviews and ways of being that are being generated by and supported and sustained by not just institutions of the academia like universities, but museums, and how universities and museums can work better together also for better futures. And in this way, WPC, coming back to some of our main tenets from the very beginning, was to focus on ways in which museums can be better, and alongside more radical pedagogies, ways of different kinds of alternative pedagogical frameworks. And so how can we work together on that? So with that, thank you so much to all of our speakers on this conversation for session 5. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for co-moderating with me. Thank you so much to the audiences here and those online. And Please, a big round of applause for all of you. Thank you. With that, welcome for those people who are scheduled today with a shift in programming. So we will commence the program for session 6 at 11:45. So please feel free to roam around for a virtual cup of coffee. And also for those of you in person, we have coffee waiting for you outside as well as some tea and snacks. So please, we'll be in the same room here at 11:45. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh my God, I feel like we should have the ability to keep talking.
Yeah.
Okay, so very explicit question that is coming from this side that we're just waiting for people to ask.
I was asking. But in terms of, yeah, what Wayne's question really is what does human mean in that sense?
Sorry, what does?
What does human mean within the human? How? So, for example, we had a big WPC conference in London where we platformed the work of Sylvia Winter about human rights without thinking through what does it mean to a human? You know, because that discourse of human rights is obviously being used as a foreign policy tool by Western countries in order to subvert democracy and, you know, to kind of promote that kind of thing. So my question would be,
What is
how-
the human in
yeah.
human rights?
yeah, and how is that being defined? Which I think you answered.
Carmen and Karine. Maybe as a kind of an introduction, I would like briefly to tell you, reflect on archives and contre-archives very briefly. The first time, and very unconsciously, in fact, I started to reflect on archives was like 20 years ago. While I was researching on Jory Smith. Jory Smith is a Canadian painter, modern painter. She was a founding member of the Eastern Group of Painters in the Contemporary Art Society. So I was looking into her archives, private to the National Archives of Canada. And within that archives, I felt on letters from Marius Barbeau. Marius Barbeau is the great ethnographer, folklorist in Canada. He's considered as the first Canadian anthropologist. And he had done some terrain expedition in on the West Coast, encountering Tahltan Nation, Haida Nation, but as well Francophone Nation in Charlevoix. And this is where he met Jory Smith. But the letter that I found in the archives were love letters. Marius Barbeau was deeply in love with Jory Smith, but we're in the 40s and Jory Smith was married. So this was impossible. And even though when she divorced, she rejected him anyway. I don't want to go into that, but so there were love letters, very chevaleresque. I don't know if you say that in English. Yes, yes. What I want to point out is what it had done to me to read those letters. I was not looking for those letters, of course. It acted like Roland Barthes would say a punctum. You see on the that detail, that trigger, emotional triggers. And I felt such discomfort as if I was an intruder, as if I was a voyeur. So at this moment, I started to reflect, what are the ethics of archiving? What are the ethics of research? As art historian, one of our principal tools, at least when you work on modernisms, principles, methodological tools, is looking at the archives, consulting the archives, trying to find traces and evidence, and to understand and better the complexity of the art milieu, the artist and the art. So I was back then starting to think, so how can I do research in a non-extractive way when you encounter such a sensitive material? Because he was very vulnerable in that letter. He was he was socially very high status, part of the elite, but then he was revealing himself. And the other moment when I started to really reflect on contre-archives is for the past 5 years, I've been working on Manitou College. Manitou Community College is the first college run by Indigenous people in the eastern part of Canada. It opened in 1973 and it closed prematurely in 1965. And I don't want to get into that complexity of why it closed so early. But so looking at the, trying to understand Manitou College, because Manitou College really, arts and media were crucial to the mission of Manitou College. So I looked into archives, institutional archives, but contre-archives as well. And contre-archives were really rich. So private archives, some people gave me access to their private archives. So what did they kept, in what order, and what did it mean for them? I also, as a form of contre-archives, encounter a lot of alumni and ex-professors and ex-employees of the college. So this was I would say, in French, we say témoignage. So this is contre-archives as well. And some of them showed me a few objects that they had kept. And for them, these objects were, I would say, traces of memories, carriers of meaning, different meanings, ongoing meanings, instead of a fixed ordered archives, associate meaning, I would say related meaning. to make a link with yesterday. And those objects activated, like reactivated affective bonds. So, and some people gave me permission to digitalize, not the object, but photos and documents from their private archives. So now I'm at the end of this research project, and I take the opportunity to say, because I'm very happy that the book is almost done and is going to the editor very soon. But so I ended up with a lot of material. So I'm now in the process of giving it back. And how do I do that in a responsible way? What would be a proper repository for these archives? How do we, in French, I'm thinking about how do we, how can I give back, how can we give back such archives in a relayed manner? And Glissant is saying, I looked it up yesterday, the exact quotation about relay. And for him, relay is la relation qui relie et qui relaie. So in that, there's the idea of narration. So une narration qui est continuellement relayée à d'autres narrateurs, an ongoing narration, une chaîne de relations. So how do we manage Contre-archives, keeping that in mind? What are our responsibility? And some feminist scholars have suggested to shift from an ethic of a legal framework in institutional archives in Canada. The ethic is framed by legal matter. So how can we shift from that to maybe an ethic of care? So I won't answer right away that question. Maybe we will discuss it later or not. I just wanted to share with you my reflection on archives before as an opening to this session. So now, please, may I end up to you.
Thank you, Edith. And so we were thinking that it might be useful to linger a little bit on Contre-archives, right? Because it's been used in so many different kinds of contexts. And of course, I'm not going to provide anything closed or comprehensive, but really openings to further discussion and exploration, which I'm sure our three presenters will elaborate for us. So these are some propositions, like lines along which we can perhaps think Contre-archives. So I'll offer a few. So one is Contre-archive as an actual set of collections, repositories, something tangible. And we can think here about the attention to often overlooked, neglected, under-resourced, Paul mentioned repressed archives. And in the context of Turtle Island, which is of course where I do my work, there's been growing tides of protests, remonstrance against national archives that have been shaped by settler colonial histories. And this often then results in turns towards Indigenous, Black, diasporic, migrant, queer archives that have previously been deemed quote unquote minor, if deemed at all. Next, we can also think of Contre-archive as method or practice. And I think of Brett Cashmere's work here. Brett Cashmere is a filmmaker and curator, and he approaches Contre-archive as a creative intervention. And for Cashmere, Contre-archival practice is less about any kind of complete opposition to an official archive. And it's more an invitation to directly engage these dominant archives through creative experimentation, negotiation, remix, any kind of potential subversion. We can also think of Contre-archive as a kind of return, or a site of ontological return for many, and I'm thinking especially of diasporic archives, turning back to personal, familial, community archives as fraught sites of memory or home. And when I say home, I'm really thinking of what After Abroad calls a homing desire. So it's in lieu of returning to some kind of stable or unitary idea of home or point of origin, which is basically impossible anyway, right? It's more about returns to archival traces in order to try to make sense of what's come before. I also think of Contre-archive as a kind of thickening with relation to diasporic archives, especially thinking about how those, for example, augment national archives, thicken them with different stories, textures, narratives, meanings, temporalities, and then also thickening in terms of an accretion of affects, which have been so beautifully discussed by Annalise and Mies as well, just in the previous panel. And related to what you've then said, we can also think of counter-archive as an ethic of care. And also to note that pointing to the importance of care is also not to fetishize care, because we've seen how care discourse can be used to basically justify existing power hierarchies, right? And an example would be institutions using this kind of language to rebrand theft, paternalism as a kind of benevolence. But one way we can think about counter-archives as an ethic of care is through reading or hermeneutics. And I think here of Tina Kamp's work, which provides a model, in her sensory reattunements to vernacular records of Black life, which asks us to tune into the radical potential of what she calls the quote unquote uneventful. Another way we can think about care is through informal labors. So this is not to discount the kinds of official archival labor and stewardships, which often tend to be overlooked in the first place, but more to recognize also the necessarily informal networks of care and relationality when it comes to marginalized, under-resourced archives. So I'm thinking here of the fact that the endurance of counter or amateur archives often indicate how these have to bypass official archival structures and travel along these divergent routes of care and stewardship, including with family members, community members, who often become inadvertent archivists, right, whose labors are crucial to these records' survival. Related to that is counter-archive as a kind of network. So rather than being permanently housed in institutional settings, we can think of examples of counter-archives being enacted in more mobile and ephemeral and community contexts, including through the creation of digital platforms, community gatherings, workshops, performances, all of these more flexible and informal configurations that allow for kind of capillary dispersals of archival knowledge and narratives back into the communities. And then finally, counter-archive is a map or a counter-map. And I'm thinking here of Julietta Singh's No Archive Will Restore You, where she writes her body as archive to her daughter, and thinking about how we often turn to counter-archives as a way to maybe repair historical losses and wounds, but there's also a way that we can perhaps understand them as maps to the future, right? That can illuminate possible ways to move forward. So we'll move on to our three presenters. We'll start with Mirabel. Mirabel Hidalgo Urbanaja is a public cultures, Worlding Public Cultures postdoc research fellow at the University of Arts, London. And then next we'll hear from, so we'll just follow the order that's in the program. We'll hear from Scots Lakota scholar Carmen Robertson, who holds a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in North American Indigenous Visual and Material Culture at Carleton University. And then thirdly, we'll hear from Corinne Zeman, an artist, curator, and scholar, and also a senior researcher and research coordinator for the Research Center of Material Culture. And the latter two will be joining us on Zoom, so we'll start with Mirabel. Just give me a minute to switch.
Can you all hear me okay, or? Okay, so yeah, so first of all, because yesterday I went straight into my presentation and I didn't thank the organizers for the opportunity of being here, and it's a pleasure to be here to have to have the chance of speaking to everyone and have this super exciting conversation about archives. So with my presentation today, what I want to bring to this roundtable is this complex relationship between databases and narratives, and in particular with counter-narratives. So I'm going to use a series of concepts from narratology or narrative theory. And I'm going to speculate on the possible features for the databases we use for counter-archives, focusing on some of the ways in which we could challenge and rethink and remodel them. So just briefly, before I start, what I understand as counter-narratives in the context of this presentation is those are the narratives that deconstruct master narratives, especially, in the context of WPC, the ones we have about global arts. They can offer alternative perspectives and can help to dismantle the canons and dominant ways of knowledge. And of course, counter-narratives might be supported and validated by the construction of Contre-archives anyway. I'm going to try and answer maybe these 3 questions here. So what type of database will best accommodate counter-narratives and counter-archives as well? What would characterize this database? And finally, what would be the implications for this practice and this shift for the methods I use, which are digital art history and data-centric methods. First of all, I don't know if you are familiar with Lev Manovic's idea of narratives and databases as natural enemies. This idea has had several responses, mostly by female scholars, such as Marilo Ryan, who is a digital narratologist or digital storytelling scholar, also Johanna Drucker, who is a digital humanist. So I disagree with Manovic as well, and I find very interesting what comes when you challenge this idea of them, narratives and databases being natural enemies. Because I think Manovic departs from a very elemental, simple idea of database, which in practice you will never encounter. So he sees the database as a group of items, is in an structured form that don't follow any order and are not connected between them. So he's ignoring the fact that data in databases is rarely presented in complete isolation. Also, he's not engaging with the connections that both the creator of the database or the user that is using the database makes when interacting with it. There are also specific conditions that frame the extractive, conceptualizing and retroactive processes that result in the creation of data that you would find in the database. And I suggest we could understand also data items as representations of the world and the narratives we tell. So now that I made this clear, the next element I want to bring to the fore is narratology. So narrative theory, which is basically the theory that studies narratives, in its foundations is very structuralist, is a theory that is dissecting narratives, is identifying the main elements, and it tries to articulate taxonomies. So in this slide, I'm showing the core structure of the narrative as illustrated by Chapman in the 70s. This structure it's been inherited by Gillette's work, mostly a French narratologist, and has been further developed and interrogated by other people. For example, Miquel has done a lot of work with it and has tried to apply it to the visual arts and using studies, material culture. So if you focus on the top layer of this diagram, you can see the basic elements of a story or story world, which is basically formed by events, actors, and the setting, which you don't see here, but it would encompass time and space. And the second layer is it focuses on how this story is presented. So basically it breaks down what is being told to us and the way it's being told to us. So if you compare the top layer of this diagram with the core structure of the CDOC CRM that you might remember from our presentation yesterday, you can see how the CDOC CRM is describing the same elements as the narratology is identifying in narratives. So you find actors, you find events, and you find time and space. And you can see in the next slide, this is the schema we are using in our WPC database. But before I move on to the next slides, so what I want to emphasize is the fact that we can understand cataloging frameworks, ontologies, and databases we use in museums, archives, galleries, art history projects as representations and conceptualizations of narratives. So we can then question databases with the tools and concepts that narratology offers. And I think this, the taxonomic and structural aspect of narratology can help us identify elements of and features of narratives and understand or assess if they are being translated into data. And if they are being translated into data, how this translation or conceptualization is negotiated, as we are trying to rethink databases and we are trying to accommodate counter narratives in these databases. But before moving on with my presentation, another very important fact that I want to highlight is that narratology, as many methods we use, draws upon textual sources from the Western canon, has been dominated by Eurocentric perspectives. So it's another discipline that is being subjected to decolonization. And the categories and concepts it has established so far are being also interrogated. So if we try to develop a narratological concepts, for example, based on the storytelling Indonesian schools or Indonesian common museums Nunin was talking about yesterday, it might result in a complete different structure or complete different concepts from the ones we've been using so far. Okay, so the first concept I want to focus on is a narratological concept I want to focus on is focalization. So it is defined also as perspective or point of view. And narratology sees focalization as a selection or restriction of narrative information in relation to the experience and knowledge of the narrator, the characters or other more hypothetical entities in the story world. It's not the same as authorship. I use this illustration in the slides because I think it explains pretty well what I'm trying to convey. So in this graphic novel in Persepolis, we see his more recent perspective of the author as she remembers them. She could have presented these events from, I don't know, the perspective of her mom or a fictional character, but she chooses to talk from her personal perspective. Focalization, it's a concept that Mikebal explores in this article. You might remember showing off to address the representation of other cultures in the Museum of Natural History of New York. So it makes us think about the knowledge production and legitimation dynamics in particular the biases and omissions visitors have to deal with when they see other cultures or even their own cultures presented in the museum. The story is being told by the museum, it's not being told by the people from the represented cultures or even from the owners of the objects. So as we try to reworld databases, I think focalization becomes a very useful concept to interrogate and rethink them in response to the need of introducing counter-narratives. So representing focalization would be very useful when we tell stories from the perspective of individuals or communities that have been excluded from museums. When we bring stories that originate from the margins, but also if we try to incorporate knowledge frameworks that have been excluded by museums. I mean, I'm trying to think about like the affective or emotive elements briefly mentioned, or even if we want to address fictionality instead of the purely factual positivist views that museums and archives generally engage with. Also, I think focalization can be also very useful when we try to surface the biases that exist in master narratives. We could present circumstances, social conventions, ideologies that have guided the extraction and presentation of the data in databases. But also, I find quite difficult the idea of, I don't know, how can we datafy focalization? How can we convert it into data? I mean, one idea could be to go back to the diagram and structure I showed in the first slides, because as we separate the story from the way the story is being told, we could maybe add data fields for focalization, and perhaps and that way you will be, I don't know, able to search the database and perform data queries based on the perspectives of from where the story originates. And maybe we could be able to compare then if we are trying to understand how this happens at scale across collections, things like that. But it remains a challenge trying to represent that. The next concept I'm joined. I don't know. Thank you. So the next element of narratives I would like to address today is temporality. So in narratives, temporality is present both in the time of the story and the time of the narration. So in this case, I will be more focused on the time of the narration because of the materiality of the digital medium. This has an imprint in the temporal nature of the narrative. It extends to the way we present objects and metadata in the database. So also think about the idea of digitizing objects and collections as a way of preserving them. You know, digital preservation is a big field, and there are lots of questions about how to do that there. And this notion, this idea, it's something we inherited from the values of durability, stability, and that comes from archives, from museums and other memory institutions. But at the same time, the digital medium is characterized by the opposite material values. So it's unstable, it's flexible, it's constantly changing, you can constantly edit databases, text, etc. Also, the digital medium is contaminating, has a carbon footprint. So extracting and amassing vast amounts of data has a clear impact in the environment we are trying to preserve. We could even connect this idea to data colonialism, colonization. I think there are interesting connections there. So then my question is, how can we take advantage of this nature of the digital medium and the database as we present counter narratives in them? So I think the digital medium can help us to skew a sort of chrononormativity that we inherited from memory institutions. It can help us question the stability of data, of the material evidence we've been using until now to construct narratives. We can even have like ever-shifting databases and narratives that can accommodate the constant updates and changing evidence. Before the digital medium was created, also the possibility of collecting data, such images and video, wasn't as affordable, as widespread as it is now. So only certain stories and cultural manifestations were recorded as preserved. So a database of counter narratives can contain this data that has been traditionally excluded. But in contradiction to this point, a database of counter narratives might as well challenge this as very extractivist nature of a datafied society we live in, and should probably explore ways of resisting datafication and the generation of narratives based on these dynamics. And the last concept I want to discuss is readership, which in connection to narratology, reader response theory has very interesting things to offer. It's also connected to discourses around users in digital media, the audience in museums. They have a focus on the interpretive element of narratives in the meaning-making mechanisms that bring narratives to fruition when readers or viewers or users read, view, watch them. Reader response theory also is focused on how subjectivity plays a role in the way we make meaning and respond to narratives. So counter narratives have the potential of reach a different audience or readership, perhaps the one that has not engaged with master narratives before, or the ones that the institution might have tried to avoid or not get involved with, or had no conversations with before. So a database that brings that potentiality into fruition should be built upon a better understanding of how readers and users connect with the different elements of narratives in a database form, and should aim to understand what resonates with them or grabs their attention. Also, what strategies they use to unveil layers of meaning and help to free ourselves from conventional ways of meaning making rooted in positivist knowledge. For again, think about like connecting with narrative through emotion or affection. So basically this is the end of my presentation. So again, going back to my questions, the one last note I have is what this could imply for the discipline I'm engaged with digital humanities or digital art history. So I want to suggest that we might use narratology or narrative theory as another framework to help us think through narratives. And as you know from my presentation yesterday, with the WPC database, we are trying to reimagine the way we relate with data and databases. We have adopted structures, data-centric quantitative methods that perpetuate power dynamics and epistemologies, but a more critical or more world digital history that defies master narratives and invites to engage with story worlds of the global, should also engage with the foundations of this methodology that that we've been focusing on until now.
Thank you so much. Is Carmen there?
Yes, I am. I don't know if you have my slide. Is my PowerPoint there to be used or not? First, I want to thank the organizers for the invitation to speak today. I really appreciate it. And Maribel's started us off talking about narrative and temporality, something that I'm also very interested in talking about today. Because I'm speaking of Indigenous relationality as archive, I also think it's very important to recognize one's ties to a specific land, and it's vital to considerations of kinship and relationality in regard to Indigenous culture and, of course, the arts. So I currently reside on Anishinaabe Aki, or Algonquin unceded territory just outside of Ottawa in Canada. And though I am a visitor to this territory, I'm not Anishinaabe. I am Scots Lakota woman from Treaty 4 territory in Saskatchewan. My grandmother is from Standing Buffalo First Nation in the Qu'Appelle Valley in Saskatchewan. And my Unchi, or great-grandmother, came to Canada with Sitting Bull and settled in the valley, as did my Scottish settlers in the 19th century. So I want to specifically focus on the, you still can't hear me? Can you hear me now? No? Shoot.
You have sound?
Yes, I have sound, but you can't hear me? Except I don't know what to do to make that better.
Yeah.
Well, perhaps we should go on and to Karine, and I can restart. Oh, can you hear me now?
Oh, yes, and we're very happy. Thank you so much for being with us, Carmen. Welcome to this panel to WPC. You're the WPC member of Ottawa. So Carmen's presentation is entitled Indigenous Relationality as Archive, the Morisot Project Database. So please welcome. I'm sorry.
To let me know when I can change the slide.
Yes,
okay,
Carmen,
I will.
if you just let us know when we can change the slide, it would be perfect.
Okay.
So thank you.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened. I want to first thank the organizers for this invitation to speak today. And I also want to recognize that I am coming to you from Anishinaabe Aki, which is unceded Algonquin territory near Ottawa. Though I'm a visitor to that territory, I'm from Treaty 4 territory in Saskatchewan. And as a Scots Lakota woman, my grandmother's family is from Standing Buffalo First Nation, and my grandfather's settler family came to Saskatchewan also at the same time. I'm focusing directly on thinking about the work of Norval Morisot, Anishinaabe artist who is a trailblazer in the history of contemporary Indigenous arts of Turtle Island. And not only did Morisot create a new visual language steeped in intergenerational storytelling, spiritual traditions of the Anishinaabe, infused with Christianity and Akankar elements, but he also draws from image-making traditions from people of his territory in Northwestern Ontario to forge a unique artistic vocabulary that has inspired many generations of Indigenous artists. His storytelling and performative ways he storied his artwork positioned his art differently. I remain confounded by racist structures that haunt all aspects of the study of his art. And in this presentation, I will, for a short time, take up the ways in which the Morisot Project, 1955 to 1985, is working towards a digital database that will hopefully reflect both methodologically and theoretically this artist's ways of knowing and seeing relationally. Next slide. Anishinaabeg, could we move to the next slide, please? I'll keep going. Anishinaabeg concepts of relationality, an interconnected kinship with all living beings is manifest in his work. Is it possible to go to the next slide, Maya?
Working, Carmen.
Oh, okay. I'll just keep working then. I was going to show you a painting called, oh, there it is.
Okay, yeah. Oh, yeah. Sorry.
That's okay. We see in this this slide an image of Morisot, but also a painting of the storyteller, the artist and his grandfather from 1978, that helps us to explain his understanding of relational ways of knowing. And it also gives us pause to think about how we could design a database that is based on story, that unsettles and complicates paradigmatic art history and museological norms. So you can see here that there is a network of kinship ties in this particular painting that helps to articulate the way that Morisot sees his world, and interconnected linkages of all living beings, not just of human relations. In the left panel of this diptych, you see Morisot's grandfather, who was a shaman, and he is very grounded in this work. On the right, we see a young artist that is Morisot, who has other forms of knowledge and ideas coming to him. But together, those ideas help to form who he was. And also that helps us to think of how we might create this database. Could I go to the next, or go to the next slide if you have if you're able? Yes. So this is Morisot's, one of his major masterworks, Androgyny, from 1983. And we see that his outline of animal spirits and figures in black reinforces interconnections of all beings. We also understand active agents within kinship obligations. We learn from the dynamic interrelated forces from the world below, from our world and from the sky world that is shown here, about how we might structure data points that connect with one another, bring together ideas, images, correspondence, audio and visual materials, as well as exhibitionary materials, to try to find a new way to think about organizing this database materials. We see how Indigenous knowledge transmission is part of the dynamic processes that make space for adaptive technologies and transcultural trajectories, yet interdependency to land remains. The themes he painted speak to audiences today, especially in the current climate, and how we reconsider relations with land and water. His visual storytelling teachings also articulate non-linear forms of temporality. On the next slide, please. Both Anishinaabe Kwe scholar Leanne Simpson and Patricia McGuire explain concepts of relationality within Anishinaabe epistemology. And this concept of relationality is obviously very complex, embedded in language and ontologies that afford lessons on how we might infuse an archive built from many, many different institutional databases that add, and it also, for us, adds opportunities to access Anishinaabe Moen, the language of the Anishinaabe, relationality, as I mentioned, and also maintain elements that capture Morisot's own voice and his conflicted connections to the art world. Can we go to the next slide, please? Artist in Union that you see on the screen here from 1972 includes conceptual ideas explained by both Simpson and Maguire. And we see Morisot inserting himself into this narrative. His coitus with Mother Earth express a oneness that demonstrates the artist's ability to visualize interconnections that we take as a starting point for database design. So how do we move beyond object-centered archive and reorient it around kinship? I think the answer involves rethinking Morisot's visual storytelling language in expansive ways. I just want to share a tiny story here. I'm going to try to be very quick. In 2004, I was invited to the Mackenzie Art Gallery in Regina, Saskatchewan with Métis artist Bob Boyer and Cree artist Neil McLeod. We were all professors at First Nations University at that time. And we were asked to take part in a conversation that might lead to the creation of an Indigenous advisory group. This was early in the days of indigenization at art institutions. And during our meeting, Bob Boyer asked the director if she understood that Morisot's work should be seen differently from the mainstream art in their collection and not included in their art collection database. He understands Morisot's art as a medicine bundle, sacredness infused with art, and it can't therefore be understood as a passive object. The paintings shouldn't be hanging on the racks in the institution's vault. A flustered director admitted she hadn't thought her invitation would provoke such a drastic reconceptualization of caring for and collecting artwork. But there are lessons here for us, and understanding artworks as active agents, as story keepers, reconceptualizes their meaning. And as such, they hold power and transmit knowledge. They too are active agents. Morisot's art challenge us to think beyond thingness. So to imagine this database beyond conventional practices means situating the data related to Morisot's art within complex, holistic system of visual storying. And while parameters around ways of seeing and understanding Indigenous art have shifted art historical discourse immeasurably as space is more regularly accorded to Indigenous arts, within most museums and their requisite collection practices, the eye remains trained on the object. I just want to circle back to some of the racist underpinnings I pointed to that pervade this project's database design. In Canada, remember that contemporary Indigenous art had, since the 1960s, been mostly collected by ethnographic museums, such as the Canadian Museum of Civilization, which is History Today, the Royal Ontario Museum, and the Glenbow, rather than institutions of so-called fine art. And Morisot's art was not collected by the National Gallery of Canada until the early 2000s. And so this creates a problematic shift of structures in the way we now come to create this database. I resist sketching any oversimplification here of the complex Indigenous ontologies and epistemologies for this talk that avoid homogenized or monolithic concepts. Obviously, Anishinaabe ways of knowing have particular understandings of time and place in concert with their kinship ties. And these play a pivotal role in the creation of the database for the Morisot project. But this could not generalize to all Indigenous art databases. The Morisot project is a SSHRC funded project that is working to critically engage his legacy. And Ruth Phillips, who was part of a panel yesterday, and I are the co-investigators with 10 other researchers. Our partner institutions include the NGC, the ROM, the CMH, CERNAC, which is used to be INAC, and many, many private collectors of Morisot's work. Each of them see Morisot's work as being collected in different ways, and this has been a real challenge for us. Could we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Oh, next one. Yeah, sorry. So we began this project in 2018 with guiding principles. The work we do today is closely informed by work of the GRASAC project. This is earlier work on an Indigenous database led by Ruth Phillips. Building on experience and knowledge gained by Ruth and many others informs the gathering together and consolidating of data from institutions, and the need to create a digital armature that could speak to the many different databases we were drawing from, not only from art collections database, but also from ethnographically focused collections, challenged us to disrupt database structures from the start. This couldn't be a one-size-fits-all. And if you could go to the next slide. A seemingly minor issue that we flagged is actually a monumental conceptual flaw in data that we received from an unnamed ethnographic institution. There was not only the lack of art-related data provided in entries, but also the descriptors that this ethnographic institution chose to convey Morisot's work. In this description of this very early work by Morisot from 1962, it's a painting of a Mishu-Pishu, which is one of Anishinaabeg's most powerful totems, and it resides in the lakes and waters, and it's been described here as a cat. That same institution described Thunderbird, the powerful being of the sky world that Morisot paints often throughout his oeuvre, as bird. Demeaning descriptors of spiritual gods as cats or birds speaks to the need to do more than simply upload data. It gives data cleaning a whole new meaning. Next slide, please. So confusion about cats and birds is not the only problematic colonial structure we've dealt with in creating this, this database. Temporality, of course, is also an issue. The storied teachings found in Morisot's work intersect, for example, with climate crisis today, challenging us to reconsider our relationship with the world. And in this 1976 painting, Land Rights, we see on the left, this was a political work that Morisot did in solidarity with the James Bay Cree, and it draws attention to the many destructive projects in Canada that exploit and continue to exploit natural resources. So the artist's vocabulary is such that this was not a static occurrence that happened in 1976, but it fits within the idea of rethinking temporal frames that queer settler scholar Mark Rifton draws attention to, called Being in Time. And he questions the usefulness of including Indigenous peoples within settler conceptions of time. In this case, Morisot's work has a historicity to it, but it also has a sense of cyclical movement, and therefore must be part of an interconnected approach. The robust complexities of colonial systems entrenched in art museums have often served as barriers towards fully configuring discourses around Indigenous art. And in decolonizing efforts revealed the temporal fluidity of the past, present, and future. And we're challenged in this database to find ways to ensure we articulate that. And the other painting on the screen is Indian erotic fantasy from 1975, and draws attention again to one of those problematic aspects of what we've seen in databases. So we discovered with bringing together data that an earlier iteration of data from the Glenbow Museum in 2010 included this painting, Indian erotic fantasy. But when we received new data from them 2 years ago, we were shocked to discover that Indian erotic fantasy and several other so-called erotic works by Morisot had been de-accessioned. This experience prompted us to have a conversation with Anishinaabeg scholar and knowledge keeper, two-spirited Anishinaabeg youth, and our Morisot project team member, Michelle McGough, who teaches at Concordia, who's the only scholar who's done work on this aspect of Morisot's work. Everyone agreed that erotic is not a term that fully captures this spiritual dimension of relationality. And so we've decided instead on a label called Love Medicine, which better captures the very complex ideas that we see at work in this particular painting, that thinks about feelings of pleasure that go beyond just a sexual act. Last slide, please. So storying water and land, kinship and resilience, Morisot's art offers opportunities for a reimagination of archives through Indigenous relational ways of knowing expressed through kinship ties. So creating archives beyond the static formulations of conventional institutional archives, though difficult, is necessary work. We're creating this archive not for ourselves, but for communities, diverse communities, and especially for future audiences and scholars to work with. It's a decolonizing effort that demands a turning away from the confines of colonialism's conceptual web as advanced by Stoller. And it's my hope that conceiving of the Morisot Project database through a lens of relational epistemologies will contribute to not only an unlearning of universalized historiographic frames and temporal concepts, but also open new ways to organize data that honors the spirit of this visual storytelling language. And I'm going to stop right there and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Carmen, for that very inspiring talk. I'm sure there will be questions later. Yeah. Oh, time's running very fast. So I'm going to keep the question for later. Yes. The camera. Yeah, Carmen, could you put the camera on? Is that possible? Yeah, okay. So thank you so much. Please stay with us. We have one more presenter, Karine Zeman, who is also on Zoom. And you're there, Karine?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, good morning or good afternoon.
Yeah, good evening.
Good evening for you, yeah. Thank you so much for being with us. So Karine's presentation is entitled Archives of the Census as Unarchival Formations. So yes, please, Karine.
Okay, there we go.
You just have to tell us when to change slides.
I will do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I want to also thank you, the WC Montreal team for convening this panel, but also the entire event. I'm sorry that I can't be there with you. I struggled at the hurdle of the visa. But yes, I'm still happy that I can join in this way. Also to note that I'm in a little bit in a transitionary phase as concerns my research. Everything always comes down to the archive, or in my case, an archive. So that's so I'm hoping to offer some set of thoughts that may be less processed, perhaps, than I'm hoping they'll be in a few months. But I do want to think about the questions around hierarchies of knowledge that are produced by the form that archives take. And for this panel, I want to suggest that we pay careful attention to the form and organization when we engage in practices of counter-archiving. In this regard, I find useful the notion of what Anne Stoller terms archiving as the census, which she posits the idea of decentralized archives that care for the histories of life before colonial occupation, or acts that resists colonial formation, expansion, and crystallization. The forms of these archives are often informal, immaterial, oral, and importantly, they have a multitude of custodians who are geographically dispersed. So I wonder, can thinking about archival form help us to make visible these parts that have been relegated, that have been pushed aside by colonial world-making, without subjecting them once again to the archival organization that is the inheritance of colonial knowledge production? Next slide, please. In order to offer a refiguration of archival formation, I want to start with the story of archival wreckage. The globally dispersed community connected to the University of Cape Town awoke on the 18th of April 2021 to scattered reports of a fire on Hurikwahu, a mountain that you might know as Table Mountain. The infamous Cape Town wind, the southeaster, was fanning flames towards UCT's upper campus. Students were evacuated and buildings cleared. Before long, a frightful image lit up computer screens and mobile phones around the world. The Jagger Library Reading Room was on fire. Next slide, please. Swiftly, scholars, activists, and artists began enumerating what was at risk, as the flames tore through the building. The university's special collection, comprising photographic collections from the struggle against apartheid, archival documents, and out-of-print books, all these faced unbearable peril. Several commentators reminded us that the priceless trove of Qam histories, namely the Blake and Lloyd archive, was lodged in the basement of the library. Was the material digitized? Many asked, disregarding perhaps the ways in which archival documents are more than just their text, more than what can be reproduced purely intangibly or immaterially. After waiting breathlessly for the salvage operation to start, we started to receive reports of what was lost in the fire during the following days. Next slide, please. Blake and Lloyd was safe, thankfully. Okay, Blake and Lloyd was safe, thankfully, but around 70,000 books, 3,500 DVDs featuring historical film and government documents from across Africa were destroyed. The African Studies collection, lodged in this library, held many treasures from the African continent, including resources for gender studies, media studies, HIV/AIDS research, and African languages studies that have been generated on the content. Next slide, please. Shock and sadness in the wake of the fire was soon followed by realizations that as it destroyed, the fire in many ways also revealed, it made sensible some dynamics of archive. Images taken by volunteers in the salvage operation circulated on social media. Some damaged but partially legible material brought into view in this way had not been consulted for years. The fire also made visible the precarity of archives, their fragility in the face of disaster. But other, more intangible things also became visible in the aftermath of fire. Next slide, please. For example, what became visible was the attachment felt by researchers and those who have deposited material into the archive in the interest of preservation. This attachment to mere matter was itself telling. Many observers pointed out that the irony inherent in the collective outcry over the loss of library material, while every summer fires wreak havoc on informal settlements across the Western Cape, attracting far less attention, concern, and especially financial aid. We further came to understand that it was not only a connection with the past that was ruptured, but also one with the future. Future work on the lost material was now fundamentally affected. Potential scholarship and archival engagement rendered forever unrealized. In the collective mourning of the material destroyed by the fire, what was it that we feared was lost? When these fires raged, it was not history as such that was in peril, but rather the site we have designated to hold deposits of our past. As the fire moved us towards this collective mourning, I wondered also whether we were not forgetting the ways in which archives have failed us. Next slide, please. I have a box of ash stored in my parents' house in Cape Town. It was given to me by someone who volunteered at the salvage operation of the Jagger reading room after the fire. Looking at the photographs that emerged after the fire, I was powerfully struck by images of rectangular books transformed into amorphous shapes, twisted in the heat of the blaze, at times melting into one another, depositing grey-black flakes and dust onto the floor in their disintegration. The ash got everywhere. It moved on the air and fell lightly onto the landscape surrounding the university campus. Residue from different books commingled together in the gutters of the building. And as the cleanup operation proceeded, ash was being transported to places designated for the collection of junk. Once afforded the status of archival objects, these ashen remains were now deemed worthless and needed to be discarded. Next slide, please. For the broader UCT community, the images of the fire and its aftermath elicited conflicted feelings. Indeed, we feared how much material would be left in ruins. Although, while the shock of this loss resonates with us today, many of us were at the same time prompted by the fire to reflect on how the collection was constituted in the first instance, and due to the conditions of its formation, what kinds of knowledge it had allowed us to generate. As the Rhodes Must Fall and Feast Must Fall movements of around 2015 to around 2018 made plain, the institution was and is still replete with colonial inheritances, both in its curricula and its institutional dynamics. How complicit was the library collection in this coloniality? The answer to this question is, of course, endlessly complicated by the robust engagement that scholars, artists, and activists have had with it over decades, as well as the fact that it also held material generated by African writers, photographers, and filmmakers. If understood in terms of entangled strands, the collection can be seen as evidence of decades of struggle with the frictions and durabilities of colonialism. Next slide, please. I thought about the collection's entanglement with coloniality when I received this box of ash and wondered what was really destroyed. The past is not lodged in the material that survived into the present, but neither is the future. And yet, perhaps some version of the future was lost, since work that might have emerged from research on the material devastated in the fire can now not be produced. But I look to other potentialities that have emerged, new trajectories for thinking about how we might access the past as it was made possible by the destruction itself. There is still a future for the material, albeit on an altered course. I'm amused that maybe the collection, as it existed in the library before the fire, was already a form of historical ash, even before the first flame started licking the corner of the wooded paneling inside the building. Next slide, please. I'm also interested in the material qualities of ash that yields to reconstruction only partially. One might be able to determine what an object was made of, but its contents, the words on the pages, the images captured by the celluloid, can never be fully reconstituted. The problem of reconstruction is, however, one that already troubles all archival work, since archives and collections are irreversibly haunted by countless silences and absences that also preclude comprehensive reconstruction. When we rely on sources such as those that were in the collection of the Jagger Reading Room in the production of historical narration, we bump up against the limits of what archives can contain. Is ash then not a more fully realized or even advanced version of the archive, a more embodied form of archive in which the quality of opacity is inescapable and its usage immediately marked as a challenge from the outset? Next slide, please. The dominant sentiment in the wake of the Jagger Reading Room fire was one of loss, that something had been wrecked. But what if we think of wreckage as offering the possibility to think archival organization anew, but not in a glib way, rather because archives have always failed us. Some pasts have already been wrecked, were already lying in ruin. Some people have had to deal with the wreckage of their histories for centuries. Next slide, please. Of course, as Michelle Rolfe-Trio reminds us, there are many ways in which silences haunt archives and the stories that we are able to narrate of the past. These concern, to summarize, the making of sources, the making of archives, the making of narratives, and history itself. Next slide, please. And from these silences, what I have done in previous work is to think about what are the absences in the archive. And this is a picture of how we tend to think of archival absence. And that means a full archive with bits and pieces missing here and there. Next slide, please. But actually, I think what I've encountered in archival work, and if I've listened to the presentations before me, that the archive is actually such a small little part in a vast field of variegated absence. And so I have termed this extreme absence and the kind of negative space of the archive, the unarchive. Next slide, please. The unarchive tells us that the past is not a puzzle to be reconstructed from fragments, but it's rather composed of tides that wash into the present, that gets remade in the present through unarchival forms of historical narration. Next slide, please. In order to think about the ways in which the past is engaged through creative work, I have been, up until now, exploring some unarchival practices. And in these explorations, I've been especially concerned with the South African context and wrestling with the difficulties of kwekwe and clam histories that are in the colonial imagination and proselytized through academic and museal discourse understood as being extinct. Next slide, please. One of the studies I've written about is the Klein Willem Arts Project, which I spoke about at the Dresden Academy last year. Next slide, please. Through an analysis of this project, I tried to argue that it presents an example of how a colonially shaped archive, the Blake and Lloyd, can be pressed into service not for the purpose of reconstruction, but to bring into view latent or relegated histories. Next slide, please. My research on this was published earlier this year in the WPC case study series through ICI. And I want to take a very brief aside just to thank everybody, to use this opportunity also to thank everybody involved in WPC. And also Carmen, you were an internal reader for that. So I just wanted to say thank you for that. Next slide, please. Positioning the Klein Willem Arts Project as an unarchival practice led me to conceive of a space in between the colonial archive and the unarchive, which I would like to think of as the archive as wreckage. I'm keen to tease out repertoires of custodianship and care to which archival wreckage can lead us. If we understand archival wreckage not simply as a ruined or lost archive, but as an archive of dissensus, dispersed, incomplete, and decentralized, then we could also do away with thinking of preservation as the central purpose of archive and even counter-archives. I use archive in an expanded sense here, and conceptually I would include in some ways museum collections, databases, and so forth, although those we can talk about the lines of distinction. In these repositories, some things get preserved always by erasing others. The archive is always pushing the unarchive out of sight. In conventional notions of archive, that which gets preserved is determined by colonial logic. As Anne Stoller reminds us, organizing and categorization is not incidental to knowledge, but determining it. To explore some of these ideas, I'm currently engaging with the 500-Year Archive Project. Next slide, please. The 500-Year Archive Project responds to the fact that the archive pertaining to the long South African past presently exists in a dispersed form, lodged in separate, bureaucratic, and protective institutions. This dispersion is a result of the ways in which institutions in the country were developed to mimic European models that refract knowledge into disciplinary silos. It renders archival holdings difficult to access for non-professional researchers, but more pressingly, it makes it even harder to apprehend the relations and networks of social, political, and cultural life before colonial settlement, as well during the formation and operation of colonialism. Consequently, historiography produced within the silos of these disciplinary interests and institutional ownership have occluded narratives from the era preceding colonial occupation and through the various strategies people employed to reckon with and resist colonial occupation. The 500-Year Archive seeks to bring these occluded aspects of the past into view by convening onto their open access digital platform digital copies of archival documents, as well as other historical fragments from a host of sources from across the globe. The project hereby establishes a framework of reference that allows more comprehensive overviews of and insights into a past that traverses the advent of colonialism and makes visible the intellectual trajectories that shape public discourse and cultural production over this extended period. Next slide, please. The project positions itself as an experimental space that seeks to establish an archival commons, independent of any institutions whose holdings are represented on the digital platform. And this has given rise to some conflict for the project as well. The 500-year archive further embarks on a series of experimental curations that draw on the material it has convened, and it does so via the Emandulo platform. Next slide, please. On Emandulo, not only are histories narrated, but the various ways in which archival material has been employed over time to make claims about the past, about heritage, are integrated in a polytemporal perspective that reflects on how these ideas shift through time. Next slide, please. Through the 500-year archive, I want to explore some of the ways in which counted histories that have been and can be made possible within the archival commons and expanded forms of anarchival curating. It seems to me that the expanded form conceived for the 500-year archive profoundly challenges state institutions that remain gripped by colonial epistemologies. Next slide, please. What I find striking about the 500-year archive is that it troubles our assumptions of what constitutes a source. We draw on sources to be able to produce enunciations about the past, to write historical narratives and make claims in the present. But as Carolyn Hamilton, who leads the 500-year archive project, has noted, nothing is a source until it has ceased to fulfill its original function. Sources are made in retrospect. Thus, by the time we co-opt something as a source, it has already been detached from the world into which it was plugged and rather becomes plugged into the world of archive. The 500-year archive, which I see as an example of archiving as the census at work, attempts to account rather than unplugging and replugging for a kind of a polytemporal life of sources. This polytemporality, as I draw on Hamilton again, entails both the backstory and biography of the archival object turned source. The 500-year archive attempts to make visible the ways in which sources have been woven into long trajectories of social, political, and intellectual discourse. Next slide, please. Counter-archiving is not about reproducing the technology of archive so as to collect those materials that have been deemed not part of historical canon. Rather, when we embark on a process of counter-archiving, we should be thinking form as much as content. I'm not trying to suggest they can be separated, but for the purpose of argument. Next slide, please. The pasts that we hope to convene into counter-archives very often lie in ruin. They are frequently the wreckage of colonial rule. But these pasts are not junk. When we turn historical materials into sources for historical narration, we should be compelled to consider the anarchival worlds to which they belong as much, if not more, as the documentary remains. Next slide, please. Moreover, it is not only the form that we give to counter-archives that matter, but also the form of the historical narrations that we produce from them. The Anarchive encourages us to recognize forms of historical narration that emerge and live on through repertoires, to invoke Diana Taylor's term. It is thus important to bear in mind that when historical material is convened into a dispersed archive, it is subjected to different repertoires than those that the archive and conventional museum curatorship elicit. These extra archival repertoires might even be understood to constitute elements of worlding. Next slide, please. The wreckage, we find ourselves in a moment where across the globe there is a demand to reckon with the colonial past. The wreckage of the past lies scattered around us. In this moment, those whose worlds were wrecked by colonialism are also working to restore these worlds. I've tried to suggest today that our response to the wreckage of the colonial past need not be an attempt to gather it together with the aim of reproducing it. Rather, we have an opportunity to embrace the dispersed forms of archive for their capacity to prompt anarchivally sensitized repertoires of custodial care, and thereby retain rather than erase the voices of the census. Thank you. That was my time telling me to finish. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen, for this fascinating presentation. I know it's late. How much time do we have, Alice? It's 1:20. I know everybody's hungry, but at least a few questions. Yeah. Okay. I don't know, May, if you have any questions, or Maribel, or even Carmen and Karine among us, but I might start if you don't mind. Okay, well, thank you. It was very, very interesting. The three presentations were very interesting. I was wondering, we were in the previous panel talking about the need for a change of structures, systemic change. I was wondering how do you see on archives, in the case of Karine, a digital armature which embrace a complex holistic views for Carmen, and narratology in your case, Maribel, how you see those structure or way of methodology, how does those methodology could inform pedagogy, the way we teach in class, art history or data database, or
Might start.
yeah.
I mean, this year I've been teaching some seminars on data visualization at another institution at King's College London, and I mean, one way of like teaching those is, I mean, some of the seminar sessions were about how to represent biases or yeah, basically political issues around data in data visualizations, and in those ways students had to go back to the sources and think what the problems were in the sources. So so in a way they need to engage with basically the structures that we're then using. So I feel like yeah, I feel like basically in those cases it's always, I don't know, the answer is like tell them to go back to the sources and engage with those sources in a critical way. And I mean, and also, I mean, I had like some responses from the students saying, but I don't, let's say if a data visualization is good, is because it makes sense to everyone and to the audience, or most of the audience, but then at the same time they need to question what if they represent data in a slightly different way. I don't know what that would trigger also in the audiences, and what responses they will get with people. I don't know if that answers your question, but those were like the kind of strategies I was using in trying to teach them how to engage with those problems around the structures and the data. So it was in a way looking at the sources, but it also also to engage with basically with the audience they are supposed to be communicating with around those issues.
Questioning the sources. Thank you. Carmen, would you like to say something about that?
Sure, just quickly, I would say that one of the things that I find this works well with in the classroom is demonstrating the need to question all structure, and also the fact that we can activate art through story to create new ways of thinking about art as an animate holder of story, and therefore not a passive object. So that's a lesson that my students get from me.
Karine, do you want to answer that? Are you still there?
Yeah. Yes, I'm here. I just muted myself. No, I just wanted to briefly mention that in the years that I was teaching at UCT, I was teaching art practice and studio work. And I think the dynamic that I think applies in this sense is that it's not about that there's already so much there with the students, that it's about finding ways of collaboratively activating and you know, giving saying that there is space for what they want to do, and rather than yeah, handing something over.
Thank you. May, did you have a question?
Does the audience have any questions before? Paul?
Yes, Paul.
Do we have a
microphone? No, we don't hear you. Yeah.
Stop it.
Eric is coming.
Oh.
Hi. Okay, that's better. Yeah. I wanted to say, I thought there were 3 brilliant presentations. Really, really, insightful, nuanced, rich. It just gave me loads of pause for thought. One of the things that I think came across in all 3 of them that I was thinking is about revisiting this notion of decolonizing the database, right? So, this idea of decolonizing the database, which obviously is something which we all are kind of working towards, and we all think is a good thing. But I wondered about something else which we've been discussing in the WPC project, with the relationship between decolonization and worlding, because it feels as though something in all of these practices, in the narratology that Maribel talked about, in the relationality that Carmen talked about, and in the anarchival practice that Karin talked about, it feels as though there's something more going on than decolonization, or something that cannot be quite captured by that. I'm thinking, what is that other aspect, perhaps more creative, more engaged with the world, dare I say it, whether worlding does capture that or not, but it just feels as, to me, sometimes we've been talking about, is it decolonization or is it worlding? And I'm wondering whether they kind of worlding complements in some respects. It kind of adds to, we need to, decolonization is necessary, and we need to kind of unlearn and unmask those colonial structures. But there seems to be something else that needs to happen, which is more creative, more anarchival, more relational, and more narratological. I just wondered whether you felt that what that other space might be, whether worlding encompasses that, or whether, perhaps it is an archive, or perhaps it is relational or narratology. But I just wanted to what that supplement is, what's that other area, whether you could maybe, have you had any thoughts about that?
I'll just jump in very quickly, Paul, and say thank you for your thoughtful comments. And I completely agree that unlearning is just a first step. What happens after that? And I like the idea of research creation, that there are many, many different ways to explore and go forward from there. And I think worlding has a role to play in some of that for sure. So I think that the biggest takeaway for me is the concept of activating, and that activation of these ideas and structures and designs they take a creativity that has I don't think has been at the heart of what archives were part of before.
Yeah, I would maybe also just say that, that in South Africa, there's the stakes of decolonization are quite different, I think, from in Europe. I mean, it's not about, there's not so much about unlearning, but it's like we have already learned. It's now we have to, put those things into place, and we need to get the balance right again. We have to say, okay, this world also deserves the world that we've learned about since you were a child, and now it is also an important and valuable and experiential and so on place to find yourself. So it's about saying it's not about in a sense kind of dismantling and then trying to find being more inclusive and so on. I think it's a case of saying, like, there are all these things that are just floating around, and they need to be instantiated much more centrally, because this is the place where they come from. So I don't know if that's worlding or whatever, but I do think that my experience has been that the stakes are quite geographically bound as well.
It's also, I think, important to note, sorry, in the context of North America, which is obviously very different, doesn't apply to everyone in the room, but a lot of Indigenous thinkers and artists have, you know, pushed for this kind of specification of this language of decolonization. And many would say that it should only mean the repatriation or rematriation of land and life. So I think we have a tendency to kind of slide it into a whole bunch of different contexts. So yeah, I agree, Paul, like maybe thinking of another kind of constellation or term is useful.
Other questions? Do you have another question?
No, I mean, I was exploring what decolonizing narratology is, but that at the same time, I'm trying to use narratology as a tool to decolonize. So, that, I mean, it created a few conflicts, and because they don't really mean the same thing. And I don't know, it's like I see also storytelling being used in many institutions as a way of decolonizing the databases. So there were a few things to renegotiate. I mean, maybe when you are like trying to decolonize with narratology, with this storytelling, it's not actually decolonizing, maybe it's worlding. Yeah, so that would be my only thought.
Hi, I have a question for Maribel. I was wondering, because Glissant's notion of relation that we've been discussing a lot these past 2 days is very linked to his conception of diffractive temporalities. He explains how the relation between different cultures is also comes with the relation of different spaces and times that are not unique nor linear. And during a presentation, I was thinking of how a database is also a way of connecting together data in a Glissant way. Therefore, I was wondering if you've been working on the possible use of Gérard Genet's la transtextuality, or even intermediality to analyze a database or understand the connections between data.
Yeah, I think that would be a very interesting venue. I haven't thought about how that could work in practical terms, but I think it would be like a very interesting option. Thank you.
I have maybe not. Oh, should we close? Go ahead. Should we close? Just, you know, we've been talking about the digital a lot since yesterday, and certainly comes up in the 3 presentations, but are there, you know, things we can think about, especially in relation to care and the digital? Because I'm thinking of Daniela Augustino's ideas around, I think she frames it as like the colonial afterlives, or the digital afterlives of colonial archives. So these intersections of colonial archives, digitization, digital archives, and issues of care, how it's especially complex because we have to then think of like post-human curation or algorithmic curation, and how do we hold, I guess, ideas of care when things get slightly more complicated.
I think it makes a nice open conclusion.
Yeah.
Lunch. Yeah, I think it's time for lunch. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you to our distinguished speakers.
Thank you. Thank you to our roundtable participants and the audience for staying for this morning's second session. I want also to thank Eric Seguin, our technician, for all the help. Yeah. Thank you. And now I will invite you, those here in the auditorium, to to grab a lunchbox outside, and please be at Oboro by 2:50 at the latest. So where we'll be we have our last colloquiums panel, that roundtable, followed by a closing reception, very interesting closing reception. So Oboro is 13 minutes, it's a 13-minute ride away from here. Get in a taxi or Uber. You can also take the subway. It's just a 20-minute ride from here as well. So you get off at Sherbrooke subway station. And Oboro's address is 4001 Berry Street. 4001 Berry Street and go to the second floor. See you in a bit. Thank you.
Thank you.
Was curious about how we go when I was young because it's right there.
Alan, I think to shut off Abby's world. Oh, no? Okay. I stopped the recording. I stopped the recording. Just stop the recording.